Good morning, everyone, or good day, wherever you may be. I'm Mike O'Hanlon with the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings, and I have the distinct privilege and honor today of hosting a conversation with my good friend, the Honorable Secretary of Defense Mark Esper, the 27th Secretary of Defense in the United States, who, of course, served as Secretary of the Army as well in the Trump administration and did really that whole 4-year stint. Mark Esper is a soldier hailing from the great state of Pennsylvania, went to West Point, spent about a decade in active service and another decade in reserve component service. Is also a longstanding resident of Washington with many experiences and jobs, but he's not a creature of Washington. I consider him a hero of the heartland. In addition to his Pennsylvania background, his congressional experience was with some of the great senators and great states of our nation, like Tennessee and Nebraska, in his service with for example, Senator Frist and Senator Hagel at that time. He's also worked in industry, which is such a crucial part of our defense establishment in the United States. He's also worked on the U.S.-China Economic and Security Commission, which has been so important in understanding the rise of China in modern times. And so his wealth of experience and background is, in addition to his background as a soldier, just provides a great wealth of experience and perspective that the nation benefited from. I want to thank him personally and publicly for his service in these last 4 years, but his entire career during particularly difficult and challenging times. And he's always handled himself with such integrity and honor, and I'm grateful as an American and as a friend. So Secretary Esper, welcome. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to the conversation.
Well, thank you very much, Mike, and thank you for the very kind and generous introduction. I think that means I owe you lunch now or something once COVID lifts. So,
yeah, and we're not too far. We're not too far apart. It's a pleasure. Although we realize friends and colleagues are around the world in this conference, and what we want to talk about today primarily is the overall national defense strategy that Secretary Esper had such a hand in contributing to in its conceptualization when he was Secretary of the Army. And then after Secretary of Mattis's tenure, of course, Mark Esper was the main driver of that overall strategy at the DoD level writ large. And of course, that strategy has implications for the Middle East. So what we thought we would do by way of conversational flow is begin big and broad and ask Secretary Esper to just outline the 2 or 3 most important elements of that strategy. I'm sure many listeners are familiar, but just to hear it from him, but also which parts of the strategy he felt most able to implement in the 1.5 years he was Secretary of Defense and the 2 years before that when he was Secretary of the Army, where we still have a lot of work to do. So that's a big set of questions, Secretary Esper, but let me please put that before you just to frame the national defense strategy as you would like as the first part of our conversation.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. So let's begin with the national defense strategy. The NDS is what we call it for shorthand. So released in January 2018, when I became SecDef in July 2019, I made clear that my #1 priority would be implementing the NDS. And we know what the NDS said. What it asserted was that we were now in an era of great power competition with near-peer rivals such as China and Russia. But it also recognized the fact that we still had to deal with rogue states such as North Korea and Iran, and of course, the enduring threat of terrorism. Part of that strategy also talked about the atrophy in our armed forces, a 2-decade focus on low-intensity conflict, and the need to shift back to put more emphasis on high-intensity conflict, to modernize the force, and to do any number of things to make sure that we're prepared for the challenges of the 21st century. So I made that my priority. In my first couple months in office, I think it was October 2019, I sat down with all my senior leaders, civilian and military alike. And what we did was building upon 3 lines of effort. Line of effort 1, building a more lethal and ready military. Line of effort 2, strengthening our alliances and growing our partnerships. And then line of effort number 3, reforming the DoD so we can, in my words, reap investments in time, money, and manpower and put it back into those top priorities. What we did from those 3 lines of effort was come up with 10 objectives, and each of those had sub-objectives, which range from everything from focus of the Department on China to updating our war plans for Russia and China, implementing new concepts such as the immediate response force and dynamic force employment, things that are relevant to the Middle East. We talked about repositioning forces, another important matter for our footprint in the Middle East, and all the way through down to establishing a new joint warfighting concept that would lead to doctrine. So very clear objectives with metrics and timelines. And I was pleased to report last summer that we had made very, very good progress on each and every one of them, but there's always work to be done. And this is a generational shift for the United States military, one that needs to continue. The challenge here, and I'll relate it to your question, Mike, up front, is clearly we need to focus on China. I mean, that in and of itself was one of a top 10 objective. But we have to deal with the world we live in, not the world we want, or not the world we think it will be next year, 10 years from now, or 30 years from now. And so what that means is we still have to address the challenges that we face coming out of Pyongyang or Tehran or other places around the world. And that gets to, the conversation today. It gets to the challenges facing the Biden administration in their first 4 weeks of office now. And so that said, the last thing I will state is this. I was pleased to hear, Secretary Austin come in, and both he and Deputy Secretary Cathix talk about China remaining our pacing challenge, if you will. And I think that's important. I think it shows the continuity in national security policy that both Republicans and Democrats and defense and security professionals, in office, out of office, have taken with regard to that. So strong bipartisan support behind the national defense strategy. I'm sure that the new administration will take a look at it and update it, fine tune it, make adjustments. That's good. That's what they should do. But it's good to see that we have continuity, because that type of continuity and predictability is important for the defense establishment, but also for our allies and partners, and in many ways for our potential adversaries.
Well, thank you. And I want to ask you in a minute about, again, applying the national defense strategy logic to the Middle East, including on the force posture
Sure.
and basing questions. But before I get to that, I know that one other thing that you really emphasized that's obviously essential in defense strategy is modernization of technology. And of course, China is the pacing threat. And as you well know, that's also led to a lot of discussion in the United States about hypersonic weapons and artificial intelligence, and a lot of the areas we feel that we are in direct competition with China. But from a Middle Eastern point of view, one could argue that some of the traditional technologies of missile defense, of anti-submarine warfare, and then maybe cruise missile defense, some of the defensive technologies where we have vulnerabilities that have been hard to completely address in modern decades, that those might be at least as important as hypersonic missiles or artificial intelligence. How do you look at our current state of modernization, including not only new offensive capabilities, but potentially new defensive capabilities? How's that going? And where do you see the greatest need for further progress?
Yeah, very good points. So modernization is a key part of this. In many ways, the military, certainly the Army, where when I was Secretary of the Army, was living off the Reagan era defense buildup. So the same top 6 defense or top 5 defense weapon systems of the Reagan era had been upgraded over decades, and we were still using them. So clearly we need to update the services. I presented a new blueprint for the future Navy, Battle Force 2045, which called for a combination of manned and unmanned ships. So each of the services needs to modernize. We also need to build out our cyber and space capabilities and do some other things. With regard to the technologies, we had identified 11 top-tier technologies. I always put AI as number 1, but that we also have to deal with robotics and autonomy, directed energy, all these things we need in the future to deal with the most dangerous threats. And it's important how I use these words, the most dangerous in the sense that Russia and China pose existential threats to the United States. But arguably the more likely ones would come out of North Korea and Iran. And you made the case, just now. If you said right now, today, Secretary Esper, if you had to have, one weapon system or more of one system in the Middle East, would it be hypersonics or air defense? I would probably choose air defense, because of the substantial missile buildup conducted by Iran over the previous decades presents a real threat to our allies and partners in the region. So air defense is important. It's also important, if not more important, for the Russians and Chinese. But it's not just a matter of technology, of quality. It's a matter of quantity as well, particularly when you're dealing with large inventories of missiles. I mean, this is a big reason why the United States and its NATO allies left the INF Treaty. It wasn't just because Russia had been cheating for many years. It was and had developed a capability that could threaten our NATO partners. But we knew that the Chinese had developed well over 1,000 intermediate range and other range missiles that could threaten our allies and partners and U.S. forces in the Western Pacific. So those are just some of the factors that when you try and build the future military, and I was focused on the future, you have to put all these considerations and take them all into account.
So now if we could turn to the U.S. military footprint in the broader Middle East, and I know again, as Secretary, you were very cognizant of the importance of rethinking even modest-sized deployments because you knew you had to be a good custodian of the taxpayer dollar, and also the size of the military wasn't growing much, even as these new responsibilities and new obligations were becoming more difficult in many places. In regard to the Middle East, even though the numbers are formally classified, and I'm not going to ask you to confirm any of them here, nonetheless, we know from press reports that we've got roughly a couple thousand troops in Turkey, maybe close to 1,000 in Syria, around 3,000, 2,500 in Iraq, and then several thousand each in most of the GCC countries, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar. We've got more in Saudi than we used to because of the threat from the air and from missile and drone attack. And of course, we've got about now 2,500 forces still in Afghanistan. Then if you want to include Diego Garcia and Djibouti, that rounds out the broader picture, at least as I define it. How would you advise a new Biden administration and the Austin Pentagon to think about options for recalibrating, maybe streamlining some of that presence?
Well, look, they have a lot of smart people on their team. They see the facts probably, I think, the same way I do. I've had a conversation with some of them. Let's look at the big picture. We had 3 good years of spending under the Trump administration, supported by Congress to increase the defense budget, and that really made a difference with regard to our readiness, whether it was any of the services, but also making these initial investments in the weapon systems that you were talking about or the technologies. But look at where we sit today. We are facing, and I just looked at this the other day, a $28 trillion debt. It's 129% of GDP. And we're going to have to deal with that. These chickens have been coming home to roost now for quite some time. So what folks are talking about on the Hill, and I hope it's wrong, is at best a flat defense budget, if not cutting money out of it. I was a big believer that we needed to maintain that 3 to 5% annual real growth. I think that's important if you're going to continue to modernize the military and prepare for the future. And we can afford that as a country. But we have to deal with these larger issues with regard to the budget, the debt, the deficit, et cetera. So that said, if your basis is that your defense budget isn't getting much better and you have the forces available to you that you have available to you, and you need to also reposition yourself in the Indo-Pacific, because I think that needs to happen as well, then you have to be able to pull forces from somewhere else to either return to the United States to refit, retrain, be ready to move out more quickly, or reposition them in those areas where of greatest concern. And that's where I had begun these COCOM reviews. And we had gone at least 1 or 2 rounds with all of them to look at that. Clearly, Central Command was a focus, and we have tens of thousands of troops there. Clearly we have a mission in Afghanistan that drives that. But my view, and we talked a little bit about this beforehand, my first experience in the Middle East was when I deployed there as an infantry officer in 1990 for Desert Shield and Desert Storm. And at that time, we had a very small footprint. Of course, for the war, we built it up. But as I look at it now, so many factors have changed. U.S. dependence on Gulf oil is 50% of what it used to be. We're now a net exporter as a country. So some of those factors have changed, right? We no longer have the threat of Iraq that we had during my time. Now Iran is the principal challenge that we face in terms of containing Iranian bad behavior, deterring them from doing what they're doing. So that has changed. What I had put in place in the past year, though, was a series of adjustments to our footprint that will continue to bring the force structure down over time. We're 2,500 now in Iraq. We could go lower, not just because we can, but because the Iraqis have made such good progress with regard to developing their own forces. And I think there are other places where we can reduce as well without changing our capability, with relying on more concepts like dynamic force employment. But at the same time, we need to take a look at that architecture of bases running up, from the GCC countries up into Iraq. and think about how do we consolidate, and then how do we gain more operational depth? How do we shift further west? How do we make sure that we are less vulnerable than what we need to be? There are a number of adjustments like that we need to make strategically to not just protect us from, a belligerent Iran, but also allow us to free up troops and allow us better access into the theater, and then really focus on how do we apply them consistent with the NDS.
I wanted to ask also about naval presence in the region. And of course, this is one where we've noted historically that people, Americans and others who are based in the region or who are responsible for the region, tend to always want that carrier close by. And yet we also know that starting with Secretary Mattis early in the NDS period, we were hoping to be strategically predictable, but operationally unpredictable, to coin a phrase that he used and that you probably contributed to creating. And also that the Persian Gulf waters may not be the best place for a big naval asset. And so I wondered if you wanted to comment on how important it is to have a continuous naval presence in any given location, or should we try to be a little bit more flexible and expansive in how we think about naval capability and not worry each and every time we may have a short gap or a different kind of asset deployed rather than a carrier battle group?
Sure. Well, let's go back to first principles. And I would say a first principle of the United States foreign policy has always been, how do we maintain freedom of commerce, freedom of navigation, whether it's the Persian Gulf or the Taiwan Strait, you name it. I think we need to be consistent with that and ensure that we can maintain the openness of those waterways, that commercial traffic can move through the Gulf unfettered by the threat of Iranian gunboats or whoever else for that matter. But I think it's a shared responsibility. And I think what we need to see is more of our allies and partners, and certainly those countries, many European countries who rely a good deal on commerce, particularly the flow of oil coming through that region, to step up more with their naval forces to assist in that. So I don't think it's, I think the United States burden can shift some on that. And that would allow us to free up naval forces to put in, for example, the Indo-Pacific or other places. Plus, we need to look at, the Navy needs to improve its readiness with regard to getting, ships into maintenance on time and out of maintenance on time. And that gets to the particular point about the aircraft carriers. You're right, everybody wants one, but there are other ways to demonstrate presence. There are other ways to have a capability that will deter others. You mentioned strategic predictability, operational unpredictability. The way we made that real is through dynamic force employment. And so once I changed the how we operationalized our bomber fleets about a year ago or 8 months ago, it freed up the bomber force to do dynamic force employment. So you're seeing a lot more use of B-52s, for example, flying into Europe or flying into the Middle East to show United States commitment to deter bad behavior. So I think we need to continue to think along those lines, more creatively about that. And look, I also think that the locus, the center of gravity, if you will, in this region has arguably shifted out of the Persian Gulf and more into the Indian Ocean. I think that it gives us more flexibility, more freedom of maneuver. And we should think about, and this is one of the taskings I had put out to the chain of command, is how do we think about shifting that locus so that we have more of that flexibility, more of that freedom of maneuver, to therefore just not deal with the threats inside the Persian Gulf, but the challenges we face just beyond in the Indian Ocean, whether it's the Chinese who are demonstrating a much bigger presence in the region. So I think over time we need to kind of make these shifts to recognize where the future is, where we need to go, and the big challenges we see, again, consistent with the NDS.
And while we're thinking about how to conceptualize the theater, I know that on your watch, we've now changed where Israel fits in the combatant command map. And of course, historically, it was affiliated with European command from an American military liaison point of view, but now it's been sort of brought into its more natural geographic home anyway, in Central Command. Could you comment on the rationale for that and the pros and cons of the decision as you saw it?
Yeah, we actually began thinking about this about a year ago in the wake of our conflict with our brief confrontation with Iran about how do we improve our war fighting stance in the region. So one of the things was, for example, how do we reduce the presence of dependence in the region? because they are vulnerable in this period of increased tensions. But how do we make sure that going forward that we can improve our operational capabilities? And we have some core principles in the military, right, such as unity of command, unity of effort. And it just didn't make sense where we were today with the warming of relations, if you will, between Israel and some of its Arab neighbors in the region. And so we started asking ourselves and talking to friends and allies, what is the impact of moving Israel out of the EUCOM AOR and into the CENTCOM AOR? And of course, General McKenzie was supportive of it. I had discussions with my Israeli counterparts. Secretary Pompeo was on board. And what really gave it a boost was the Abraham Accords. I think that, very successful effort coming out of the White House really kind of gave additional boost to the concept. And so we moved forward on it in the fall and, put the paperwork in and got everybody aligned. And I think at this point it was eventually signed, but it made a whole lot of sense because whether it's Israel or any one of the Arab partners in the region, the biggest threat to them, to us, is Iran, is a belligerent Iran, continue to conduct its malign behavior throughout the region. And the more that we can work together in terms of dealing with that threat, deterring it, containing it, the better we were. And bringing Israel into the fold just makes a whole lot of operational sense. And we had, again, the time had come to do that. And I think there's been really no aftershocks from it as well. So I think that kind of proved the point.
So now coming back to the Western part of the theater, I know that your last trip as Secretary of Defense was to Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, if I recall correctly. And I know that must have been a fascinating experience. And I just wondered, also speaking of the Abraham Accords, as they involved Morocco, I wondered if you wanted to comment on what you took away from that trip and how the world looks from that side of the broader region.
Sure. It was, I traveled there in the fall to Malta, Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. And it was a great trip. I had a chance to meet with the leaders of each of the countries and their ministers of defense, and to really get a good appreciation for how they saw the world. And it's a very interesting nexus, right? Because they have one foot in Europe. They have, obviously they're in Africa, but they have the perspective of Africa and AFRICOM. But yet they look a lot toward the Middle East and what's happening there, given the history, the religion, and everything else. So a crossroads of three different continents and religions and everything else. And I got a lot of good insights. And again, it convinced me the importance of growing partners, enabling partners like those three countries to really help shape a positive environment where we follow the international rules and norms, where we have allies and partners to help us deal. In this case, the challenges we faced there was with the threat of terrorism. They're very concerned about mass migrations coming up, moving into Europe, and they face terrorism threats as well. And they see what's happening in the Sahel in Western Africa. So very interesting trip, but it was given that they're situated on the African continent, the degree to which they paid attention to what was happening in the Middle East was really eye-opening.
I'm going to start to bring in some audience questions now in the second half of our conversation. I've still got a couple of my own, but I'll weave those in. And one is put very, very colorfully, so I will take the liberty of just reading it to you. For the Honorable Secretary Esper, to your eternal credit, you kept the Mattis National Defense Strategy energy up, and you avoided the not invented here problem, although actually, of course, you were part of the team that came up with it. But it's still true, and I take the point that a lot of secretaries feel the need to make some abrupt change, and you preserved a lot of what you agreed with. But now to continue with the question, but the Pentagon was slow to respond and remains so. What advice do you have for Secretary of Defense Austin to keep the pressure on a recalcitrant Pentagon bureaucracy to respond to this typical strategic shift?
Well, thanks. I'll take that as a compliment because you're right. I mean, obviously, I was in the building when it was being crafted, and to me, when it came out in January 2018, I thought the biggest thing I could do was implement it. We hadn't seen much momentum on that front. And I was a believer in it. And look, I could look at any strategy and this one, and there are things that you can improve upon or change. And eventually we did actually through the process. But I didn't see any need in terms of opening up the NDS and taking 6 or 8 months to rewrite it just so it had my personal fingerprints on it. We didn't need that. We needed predictability, and I thought it was a very strong document to begin with. And I suspect as the new team reads it, they will largely agree. But again, it is a new administration, so they're going to put their fingerprints on it. The challenge is for any administration, and I've talked to my predecessors about this, is how do you get the Pentagon bureaucracy to move? Part of it is people just are reluctant to change and don't want to change. In some cases, they're protecting their own turf, their own piece of the budget, whatever the case may be. And that's not, by the way, it's not just when we say the Pentagon, it's not just the building. It's everything from the services to the combatant commands, to the fourth estate, to all these different players. And in some cases, they are enabled by the Congress. And that's a challenge. And so, and we, in the context of supporting civilian leadership, I think I think the new team will take a look at the NDS. They'll make adjustments as they rightly see it, based on the priorities set forth by the president. And then I think what you got to do, what I try to do is, if you want to effect change in large organizations, particularly there's none larger than the Pentagon, is you got to get involved. You got to get your hands dirty and spend a lot of time on it. I spent week after week my first 3 or 4 months in office just to find nearly $6 billion in savings. And it takes that type of involvement if you're going to effect change and just staying on top of people. And so I had those top 10 objectives as part of the NDS, and we got a lot done in terms of moving that needle forward, but you can't do it in 18 months. It takes years of effort. You've got to put the budget behind it. You've got to put your personal political capital behind it. And you got to get the Hill on board also. And that's maybe a bigger challenge in many ways. But it just takes that personal leadership, time, and attention to do that amidst everything else that's going on. And that's obviously a challenge I faced, is you have a busy world out there and every day you're facing new events. But I try to stay focused, to dedicate a little bit of every day to how can I move the NDS forward? How can I, because I thought it was so important to the future of our nation's security to effect that change.
So while we're on the NDS, and I'm going to come back in a minute to a question about Syria policy from a Turkish colleague, and so we'll get into that in just a second. But you've already talked about China a bit this morning, but we haven't really talked much about Russia, and yet the NDS does. The NDS, to my mind, puts China and Russia on a nearly equal plane. You've mentioned that China is the pacing threat in terms of resources and technology and size, presumably. But of course, Russia has 5,000 nuclear weapons and has also a big interest in the broader Middle East, historically and today. So I wanted to ask how you thought about Russia. And rather than just that's a huge subject, huge question. So let me put a little finer point on it, but I invite you to go wherever you wish. While I'm concerned about Russia's behavior and its presence in Syria and Libya, and perhaps Egypt, and perhaps elsewhere, I also feel that there's been some progress from a US and NATO perspective in at least stabilizing our deterrent posture in Eastern Europe. That may not extend all the way to the Middle East, but it may, in a broader sense, help stabilize US-Russia relations somewhat. Do you share my view that, as troubling as the relationship with Russia still is, that there's a little bit more stability, at least in the eastern flank of NATO? And while that doesn't solve the challenge that Russia may pose to our interests in the Middle East, it's at least one step forward in the broader national defense strategy implementation.
Yeah, so again, stepping back some, when I look at those top tier, near peer threats, I always prioritize China. Why? Because I look at the size of China, 1.4 billion people. I look at their economic growth. I look at the fact that they're now the second largest economy in the world. I look at all these things, all the natural resources they bring to bear, and I compare it with Russia, and I see in many cases just the opposite. And the NDS talks about this to some degree. I think in the near term, both countries are on par with one another. As you rightly said, Russia has far more nuclear weapons, probably a more capable military in terms of their ability to conduct combined arms operations and project forces. But I think that fades over time, time being 10 or 15 years, while China continues its ascent. And by the way, I'm not yet prepared to call China a threat. I may sometimes slip and use that because it's the lexicon that I grew up with, but I don't yet see China a threat. They don't need to be a threat. Much of that will depend on how we deal with China and how we deal with China with our allies and partners. clearly we all need to get on the same sheet of music and get China back into the fold with regard to, living by international rules and norms and not bullying their neighbors and doing all these bad things that they're doing now. But back to Russia. Clearly Russia has played a weak hand pretty well the past 10 or 15 years, and they've been very aggressive. We saw what they did with their annexation of Crimea, the invasion into eastern Ukraine, Georgia. We can go around the world. I mean, the Baltics are very concerned about what was happening. And so I do think the good news is that the NATO allies have come around to recognize that we now deal with a more belligerent, or more, I should say, more aggressive Russia. And I think the fact that over the past few years, they've increased considerably their defense spending. Now, of course, it needs to be focused really on modernization and readiness. And we're not quite there yet. General Walters, the SHAPE commander, has done a really good job in bringing that along. We tried to do that in NATO, but we still need too many allies are spending not enough money on defense. And to really deter Russian bad behavior, you need that. And as you know, I was looking in the context of instructions I got from the White House to move more of our forces further east, right, to the frontline states, and less in depth in Central Europe. And so I thought that was important because we have some really nervous allies in the Baltics, Poland, and of course I also I traveled to those countries. I traveled to Bulgaria and Romania on a couple of occasions. So the flanks are where I'm particularly concerned. And I think the one area that we got to keep a careful eye on is the Black Sea, because you have Russia there, Turkey, a confluence of things are happening in the Black Sea. We have a naval presence. And so the flanks are what always concern me most. The flanks, again, being the Baltics, and then down in Bulgaria and Romania along the Black Sea. And we have to continue to unify NATO, increase our defense spending, improve our readiness, and look at things differently. We cannot remain static. If we remain static, then we're going to fall behind. We're going to miss the future.
So that leads now to the question from the audience about Turkey and Syria. And, I feel almost a little bad trying to solve this problem or ask you to solve it in a hour-long conversation. David Petraeus called Syria the, I think, strategic Chernobyl of our time for the sheer complexity of the problem. And to your credit, and that of Secretary Austin, when he was at CENTCOM, but also his successor, and General Dunford, General Milley, President Trump, President Obama, ISIS was defeated. The caliphate was eradicated. And that's no mean feat. And it took some doing. And that's a huge accomplishment. By the same token, however, we also know that President Assad remains in power in Syria. There's no realistic probability of his being removed that I can see. And there remains a terrorist threat in part of northwestern Syria in particular, and certainly an unsettled U.S. presence in the northeast, where we've tried to work with Kurds that we consider allies, but that our Turkish ally considers affiliated with terrorists because of their cross-border links to the PKK inside of Turkey. And as you can imagine, the question from our Turkish colleague had to do with how do we define who's a terrorist if we're prepared to work with Kurdish allies, and how do we ensure that any cooperation we have that's ongoing in northeast Syria not somehow spill over into allowing the YPG in Syria, the Turkish group there, to support the PKK in Turkey, which many Turks tell us is actually one and the same organization, or at least the ties are so close that there's really no way to distinguish. So how do we ultimately address this contradiction, if you will, that maybe in the short term we needed to work with the Kurds in Syria to defeat ISIS, but now we're sort of stuck affiliated with a group that we may feel loyalty to, but our Turkish allies consider essentially an enemy? It's a big question. I don't know if you have any wisdom you'd want to convey on that.
Well, I thought you might give me an easier question like solving Mideast peace.
Exactly.
Boy, it's so complicated, and it goes back hundreds of years. This issue between, Turkey and its relationship with its neighbors, and it's just a very complicated, complex problem. And quite honestly, you can spend a lot of time focusing on this and missing the bigger picture. And I know it's a big picture issue for Turkey. I get it. I understand that. And we have a small footprint in Syria now to ensure that ISIS doesn't return, and it's been effective. It's been a low-cost investment. But I wouldn't go any further than what we are now in terms of that issue or getting involved in that. I think we have bigger issues to deal with, and if not, we find ourselves frittered away all around the world in these isolated issues that are important to partners and allies, but we have to put them in the context of other things. If you were asking me my concern to talk about an issue I'm concerned about Turkey, it's not that. I'm concerned about Turkey's role in NATO, and how they are working together with the United States and other NATO allies to really ensure that the alliance is as firm as it could be. We've had in many ways Turkey playing a spoiler role, right? It's acquisition of the S-400 from Russia. It's confronting, if you will, maybe too strong of a word, French warships in the Med. It's friction with the Greeks. I mean, that's what I get concerned about, and not this small corridor in northeast Iraq with Syria and all that, and this ongoing issue between the PKK and the YPG and stuff like that. Again, that's important and needs to be dealt with, but I think there are bigger issues out there for the United States and Turkey to deal with rather than this specific one.
One follow-up: do you think there is a way that we can somehow mitigate this Turkish concern? In fact, does our very presence and collaboration with the YPG potentially give us some transparency, some eyeballs on what's going on, and some leverage to try to discourage the YPG from playing any supporting role towards the PKK?
Again, I think we have to, address probably the bigger issues with, Turkish governance, how they deal with these issues. I'm not prepared to offer any solutions today about this. I know it's important to Turkey, but I think there are bigger issues there, and this is not a matter that's going to be solved by the United States. It's a very complex, complicated, historical, social, cultural problem.
So just a couple more questions as we look to wrap up here pretty soon. And this also is a complicated question of sort of political military interaction with the broader Middle East region. But as you know, the United States has longstanding and important relationships with Egypt and with Saudi Arabia, two of the huge countries of the region. And yet both of these relationships are under considerable scrutiny. In the case of Egypt, of course, because of the strong-armed rule of President Sisi. And in the case of Saudi Arabia, even again this week with the new findings on Saudi complicity in the killings of Jamal Khashoggi 2.5 years ago. This is a longstanding debate about how does the United States maximize its influence with countries like that, countries where we have important overlapping interests, but we don't approve of everything they do with their governments. Do you have any insights from your experience about how we can best influence those two countries in particular? If there are any levers or any ways of working with them and, quietly or publicly, that can give some hope for progress? Over.
Yeah, I like to say, I've said this, I think, at my confirmation hearing in July of 2019, that we are best when we lead with our values, and those values of human rights and freedom of the press and freedom of religion and treating people properly. All those things that, again, are common threads in U.S. history, U.S. foreign policy. They go all the way back to our Constitution. I think we're strongest when we lead with our values. So we clearly need to engage these countries. They are partners. We should never set aside our values. We should have frank, candid conversations with them, certainly in private and sometimes in public. And we should begin there. On the other hand, if we turn these values into a litmus test, we'll find that we'll have fewer and fewer friends around the world. So I think our challenge is to figure out how to do that in a way that we can work with them, help them get to where we would like them to be, and at the same time making sure that we're taking our national interests in concern as well. Egypt has a very capable military, and they use a lot of American equipment. We've trained with them in the past. We have U.S. forces in Egypt under the MFO. So we just can't walk away, and we shouldn't walk away. We need to continue to work with them. My concern with Egypt is that for one reason or another, we can discuss why, but they're turning more to the Russians to get their equipment, and that's not a good turn for us. We need them in our orbit, if you will. The same thing with the Saudis, more so for any number of reasons. If I had to ask for the Saudis, I think what we need from them and from the other Arab states on the Arabian Peninsula is to stop this fighting, these issues between them, whether it's the rift, you name it. We need to focus on the bigger challenge, and the bigger challenge facing all of them and Israel and other partners in the region is Iran. But instead, they're caught up in squabbling over this issue or that issue. And for all of them, I think the bigger thing would be for us to all work together to deal with the bigger challenges we face in the region. And then, there are other issues we could talk about with the Saudis. I think they need to continue to work on their own readiness. All the countries need to build out their own capacity when it comes to their armed forces, all those things that will allow us to deter Iranian bad behavior going forward.
So just two final questions to wrap up here, one on Afghanistan, and then one from the audience that just came in on the issue of U.S. nuclear command and control and how we handle the chain of command, an issue that came up in recent weeks in the United States. But on Afghanistan, again, you managed a process that was tumultuous at times, but seems to have left us in a place where, our fingers are in the dikes in a few different places, but the situation is sort of holding. But the overall trend line seems unfavorable militarily in terms of the levels of violence, in terms of the amount of the country that the Afghan government, with modest NATO support, is able to sustain control over. It's not as if anybody's on the brink of, being overrun tomorrow, from what I can see. But I would be curious as to how you see the Afghanistan mission today. And are we essentially, as some of my colleagues, not myself, but some of my colleagues argue, essentially on an inevitable downward path towards defeat someday, unless the peace process pulls out a rabbit from the hat? Or do you think that the military situation is more or less stable? And even though it's way too violent and regrettable, deeply tragic, it's more or less one that the Afghan government can continue to hold on to with just a few thousand US and NATO troops there?
So I would say this much. We've been in conflict in Afghanistan now for 20 years, 21 years. I think most people would agree at this point in time, the only way forward really is through a political process where both parties sit down and work it out and come up with a way forward. And that's why I supported the peace agreement put forward by a State Department. And, look, it wasn't perfect. Some would say it wasn't great. And I would say it was good enough. And despite, the ups and downs, the bumps, the turns in the road, we do have a situation now, at least we did a couple months ago, where the Taliban and the Afghan government was sitting down trying to figure out a way forward. And I think that's a good thing. It's the first we had seen in 20 some years. But my support for the plan was also conditional in the sense that we had these terms of agreement in the agreement between the United States and Taliban. And we had implemented our side of it in good faith. But it's fair to say that the Taliban have not. The key parts being a reduction in violence, sitting down in good faith with the Afghan government and trying to negotiate a way forward. And of course, making a break with Al-Qaeda. At the end of the day, that's the most important part, because at the end of the day, we went into Afghanistan to ensure that that country would no longer be a safe haven for terrorists to attack the United States. And I don't think we should leave until we have confidence that that is the case. And the premise of the Afghan deal was that they would come up with a new governance model, and key to that would be ensuring to keep the terrorists out of the country, and that would give us a reason to leave. So, at this point, I made this clear when I was in the administration. At the end, I thought we should hold it 4,500 until the conditions on the ground were met. Because at the end of the day, the 2 points of leverage we had over the Taliban was our presence. And by the way, I shouldn't just say our presence, because the NATO allies are there. And by the way, they're there in larger numbers than us, which is a testament to our alliance with them and the leadership of Jens Stoltenberg and others. But A, we had presence there that they didn't like, and B, we could inflict violence upon them, and we could do that by ourselves or in support of our Afghan partners. So lifting that, when you do that, you remove your leverage. So, the Biden administration is a tough position in terms of how they figure out the way forward. It needs to be done in close consultation with our Afghan partners and our Europeans and other allies on the ground. But I think that metric still holds, is we have to make sure that, again, Afghanistan doesn't become a safe haven for terrorism. And I say that as somebody who wants to get out of there as badly as anybody else. We're spending $5-6 billion a year there. We have troops rotating in and out. Again, in the bigger issue of things on the plate, I'm more concerned about repositioning ourselves for China and then for Russia. So, and I've seen Afghanistan from the first year we were there all the way through the last year we were there. So that's generally my views on it.
So there is this big question on nuclear command and control, and it's getting a little bit removed from the broader Middle East, except of course that if Iran ever did have a nuclear weapon, people in the Middle East are going to be very curious as to how US extended deterrence may apply. So let me frame the question in those terms. And of course, I don't want this just to be about the Trump administration experience, but more generally, we have a US system in which the president, through the Secretary of Defense, could then transmit a command to a strategic command by which a nuclear attack could in theory be launched without any congressional role and without many people in that chain to potentially exercise restraint or caution. And again, I've had this question or this concern well before the Trump administration, so I don't want this to sound like a question about just one president. Did you come away from your experience with any similar concerns that maybe we need to rethink the checks and balances on potential US nuclear weapons usage in a crisis? Or do you think that the current system has enough safeguards and checks and balances to be dependable and safe against all different kinds of possible concerns?
So you have to go back and look at how this system emerged, right? And I'm not a nuclear historian, and I'm sure somebody will catch me on something. But look, we knew that during the height of the Cold War that at any moment, if the Soviets attacked, time of flight of missiles, you'd have 30 minutes to decide what to do, and you would or would not, depending on how you reacted, lose your second strike capability because the Russians could do a first strike. And so that rationale ended up taking us toward mutual assured destruction. In other words, one side or the other wouldn't initiate a first strike because there was a guarantee that the other could launch a second strike, and therefore it would be a lose-lose situation. Of course, any nuclear conflict will be a losing situation. So we still have those timelines today and those challenges. And I think there are enough safeguards in the system. There are enough trained people who know what that is. There's not one single button sitting there that goes all the way down to a nuclear submarine carrying missiles or a silo or a bomber. There are a series of steps that have to happen, and there are safeguards and all those things built in. So if you want to have a credible capability, certainly a second strike capability, it's not just the weapon systems. And of course, we're modernizing the triad now. But the second point was you have to have a modern nuclear command and control system. Another feature, another important component of this system that we are also investing billions in to modernize as well. But the processes also have to be efficient. If the enemy knows that it's going to take you, hour, 2 hours, or whatever the case may be to make a decision, then arguably they might presume you've lost that second strike capability. I don't know. I haven't thought through this much, but I believe there are enough safeguards in place, checks and balances, et cetera, to ensure, something that the right decisions are made at the right time. And by the way, it's hard to go back and find in history when a bolt from the blue like this might have happened. If we get in a situation where we think nuclear weapons are going to be used, typically you have a lot of warnings and indications. Those consultations have to begin, not just within the government, within the executive branch, but with congressional leaders as well. So we all understand where this may head to and what may be called upon to do. But this authority is given to the president for this reason, and it's held well for years. It doesn't mean we shouldn't take a look at it, but I'm confident that we have safeguards, checks and balances in the system to do that.
Well, that's a good note to finish on, as far as I'm concerned, because it's a nice word of reassurance. And also just want to thank you so much, Secretary Esper, again, for your wisdom today and for all you did for our country in recent years, all you continue to do as you consider new walks of life and new challenges ahead. So on behalf of everyone at Brookings, everyone as part of this conference, I want to, and again, on behalf of myself and Natan Sachs and Suzanne Maloney and John Allen, thank you very much for being with us today and for all you've done. So
thanks,
signing
Mike.
off.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks for hosting it. And I want to thank the Brookings team for pulling it all together. It's understand the conference has gone very well. So thank you all very much for bringing this together and for inviting me to join you.
So we'll be signing off now from Brookings and wishing everyone the very best. See ya.
Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Daniel Byman. I'm a senior fellow at the Middle East Center at Brookings, and I'm delighted to be the host for our next panel. I'd like to welcome everyone who's been joining us for the session all week, which I think has been fantastic, and say a special thanks to those who are outside the United States, whether in the Middle East or around the world. We're really delighted we could all be together. When we talk about the Middle East, of course, one of the most difficult things to talk about are the really wrenching and bloody conflicts that have been plaguing the region for many years. This is something that is horrific for the peoples involved. It also creates very difficult policy issues for the states of the Middle East, but also for the United States, Europe, and other countries with a strong interest in the region. We're going to look at three of these conflicts in today's panel: Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. And I'm delighted that we have three fantastic experts to talk about these. We have Jomana Kadur, Marcin Al-Shamari, and Gregory Johnson. Their bios are available to you separately, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through them. I just want to say that they are three fantastic people, and what I would stress is, in different ways, they all have a Brookings affiliation, and it's something that we're very proud of. So with that in mind, I really wanted to kick things off by asking a big question to all three of the panelists. And if it's okay, Greg, I think I'll ask you to go first, and then ask Jomana, and then ask Marcin, which is, I'd like you to kind of look at your country of expertise, and so Iraq, Syria, or Yemen, and describe the path it's on. Where do you think you'll be just a few years out? So not way in the future, but a year out, 2 years out. And is there a better outcome? Is there some way that the United States, states of the region, others with an interest can kind of push it onto a better path rather than on a more dangerous path, which it might be on right now? So Greg, why don't you begin us, please?
Yeah, thanks so much, Dan, and thanks to everyone who's watching. So with Yemen, unfortunately, the trajectory is not good. Yemen is basically Humpty Dumpty after he had his great fall. Yemen has fallen. It's broken into a number of pieces, and Yemen is not, I'm very pessimistic that Yemen can be reconstituted as a single state or even as two separate states, say, prior to the unification of North and South Yemen in 1990. I don't think that's the situation that we're looking at. I think there are basically about 7 or 8 different Yemens that exist right now, all of whom are on different trajectories. So when we look out, say, 2 or 3 years, the concern that I have is that what we talk about is basically one war in Yemen. So we talk about this Saudi-led war in Yemen, but I think there's actually 3 separate wars that are happening simultaneously in Yemen. There's the US-led war on counterterrorism, there's the Saudi-led regional war, but there's also this local Yemeni civil war. And I think that's really important because the US, with the Biden administration, with the new US envoy to Yemen, Timothy Linderking, as well as the UN special envoy, they're all focused on ending that Saudi-led regional war, Saudi Arabia against what it sees as an Iranian proxy and the Houthis, who have control in the north with the capital city of Sana'a. And my concern is that that war is likely to end at some point over the next couple of years. But once that war ends, this local Yemeni civil war is going to take center stage. And this anti-Houthi coalition that has really been held together by Saudi money, by Saudi influence, by Saudi pressure, that anti-Houthi coalition is going to break apart. And in fact, we're already seeing this in Yemen. President Hadi, who lost his capital of Sana'a in 2014 to the Houthis, he lost his temporary capital of Aden to a southern secessionist group in 2019. The Southern Transitional Council. There's a group on the Red Sea coast, Tariq Saleh, that used to be affiliated with the Houthis, but now is fighting the Houthis on the side of the Yemeni government. But this government anti-Houthi coalition is very fractured, very fragmented, and is likely, once the Saudis withdraw, and I think the Saudis are looking for an exit in Yemen, once the Saudis withdraw, that coalition is going to collapse. You're going to have all these different armed groups, these different warlords that are trying to hold and seize as much territory as possible. And the situation in Yemen is such that no one group has enough guys or guns to force all the other armed groups in the country to submit to their vision for the state. But all of them, or almost all of the armed groups, have enough men, have enough guns that they can act as a spoiler to any sort of a national reconciliation. So what I think the US can do is, I think the US is doing what's right at the moment. That is, they're working very hard to end this Saudi regional war that I've talked about. What the US needs to do is not declare victory once the Saudis withdraw, but actually work on ending the local Yemeni civil war. Because if that Yemeni civil war is not ended, then Yemen is going to fracture and fragment. Humpty Dumpty's not going to be put back together. And that's going to raise a number of concerns for US national security, from a humanitarian crisis that's already the worst in the world, counterterrorism threats, terrorist groups that sort of thrive in these cracks, as well as shipping lanes along the Red Sea shipping corridor. So I'll sort of end there, but that's the pessimistic view from Yemen.
Unfortunately, that is a depressing beginning, although it sounds like it's, you may even be relatively optimistic given some of the writings you've done on this. Jomana, please go ahead.
Thank you, Dan. It's great to be here with you and among the other panelists. I will, present a very brief picture of what Syria looks like today, just because I think it's very hard for most people not to know what Syria looks like. But then I'd rather spend a little bit more time talking about the US and its role. So like Yemen, Syria is an incredibly grim picture. Economic challenges abound. There's a sanctions regime imposed by both the United States and the Europeans, unfortunately placed on an unresponsive regime that has no intention of capitulating. You have at least 13 million refugees and displaced peoples, civilians that are facing dire conditions both inside of Syria, and we've saw that this week the lira actually hit the worst ever that it's ever been. But they're facing dire conditions both inside of Syria as well as in neighboring countries where many of them are undocumented and are facing hostile governments. And you have a humanitarian situation that is completely out of control. And I'll go into that in a little bit. And then finally, we finally saw a verdict in Germany this week in the Koblenz trial that sentenced the first regime official for war crimes. I think he's going to serve about 4.5 years for the crimes he perpetrated. And many Syrians are disappointed that war crimes are, that crimes have been perpetrated, and yet the man is only going to face 4.5 years in prison. But nonetheless, I think it's the first of what we hope to be many future trials for at least some regime officials for what they have done. But I think the road to pinning any of this on Bashar al-Assad is still a long way to go. So that's basically, a bird's eye view of where Syria stands today. Now, in terms of the United States, I think Syria is a conundrum for US policymakers because it's complex. And frankly, I think most policymakers would rather not deal with it. But I do believe that Syria is a paradox for this administration. Many of the individuals that have joined the administration have stated on the record that they believe Syria is sad, it's tragic, yet that they do not think it's a priority for the United States. And that the reality is that despite the fact that we would rather declare Syria a non-priority, I think Syria goes to the heart of every major stated objective in the Biden administration. And that's namely, great powers competition, strengthening multilateral institutions, and effectively addressing Iran. I'd like to go into these, Dan, but I don't know if you want me to come back to them later or to continue now.
Why don't you continue now for a bit, because this is such an important conflict, please.
Sure. So, on the issue of great powers, according to National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, the Biden administration is committed to addressing the challenges posed by the rising great powers. And that includes, obviously, China and Russia. And most will agree that it was the Syrian theater that Russia exploited to achieve its global resurgence that we've seen over the past decade. Last week at the Munich Security Conference, President Biden was very, unequivocal in his condemnation of Russia's activity. And frankly, that was something that President Donald Trump neglected to address during his time in office. But Russia and China have also managed to step into the region, including in Syria, and to offer autocratic actors an alternative scapegoat, as long as they cooperated with them and basically expected, no delivery in terms of reforms or democratic progress. But I think the worst part of this is that even though Russia, vied for the position of chief broker in Syria, It's not an actor we can depend on to deliver tangible desired results. Outside of a partially executed chemical weapons program in August 2013, every other contribution that it's claimed to make has fallen far short of what UN Security Council 2254 asks for, and that is, basically the resolution that the United States has adopted as the cornerstone of its strategy. They haven't addressed mass displacement. They haven't created a more stable Syria. They haven't even been able to halt the violence. And so I think, when the administration is looking at the great powers component of this, it's important to know that they are going to have to look at Russia, and Russia's involvement in Syria is an important part of that. I'll just briefly move on to the multilateral institution piece. And I think this does impact both Syria and Yemen. The United Nations has suffered incredible damage to its reputation as a result of the paralysis at the UN Security Council. Frankly, the UN has become almost impotent in the last decade. What used to be a neutral platform capable of facilitating peace in countries like East Timor is no longer able to ensure even the opening of one border crossing into Syria that is required to keep 4 million people alive. And I think this disillusionment with the United Nations is hurting the very institutions we helped create and that we value. And this goes, this supports the arguments that people like, former President Donald Trump make when they want to cut off the, support to the WHO in the middle of a pandemic, that these institutions are corrupt and they're ineffective. And frankly, President Biden has a history of UN reform. In his 1999 Biden-Helms Act targeted issues of corruption and mismanagement. So I think this is a really great opportunity to prioritize that. And finally, I just wanted to briefly talk about Iran. I know it's going to come up, but it's also, part of this paradox. The Biden administration wants to go back to the JCPOA. Iran is expanding in Syria. It's entrenching itself. The strikes last night are a perfect example of that. Iran will also, through its proxies and militias, is going after different activists, assassinating dissidents, arbitrary arrest, displacement of populations, all of which have the potential to destabilize Arab societies moving forward. I'll stop there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jumana. Marcin, please.
Thank you, Dan. You raised a very pragmatic question, and it's very difficult to answer, but I'll try to answer with as much clarity as my co-panelists have. Iraq is a bit of a different case than Syria and Yemen, I would say. And the reason is, to answer your question shortly, the path that Iraq is on is a path towards democratization, but a very, very difficult one. And you need to distinguish, or we need to distinguish, between democracy and democratization. Democracy, when we say it, is a very lovely term that has very positive connotations and seems easy and straightforward. But the path to democratization that we've seen throughout world history is something that's very difficult and really paved with a lot of obstacles and challenges. So my short-term view for what is ideal for Iraq in the next few years would be to have some kind of security stability, because it needs that desperately in order to be able to improve its economy and to come to peace with itself, as President Saleh mentioned on Wednesday in his speech with Brookings. But the issue is, Iraq has been through so many crises since 2003 that it really hasn't had a chance to catch its breath. I mean, we went through occupation and the time of state transformation, almost immediately into a civil war, and then onto ISIS. And throughout this entire time, we really haven't been able to find a moment to achieve any kind of security stability that would allow us to, for example, attract foreign investment and to address the economic problems that we have that stem from our oil dependency in Iraq, as well as to address, longer term societal issues like the social contract we have in Iraq, which was really created by a predatory state. And so long as we can't achieve stability, we won't be able to remedy that. So how can the US and regional allies or regional partners and states promote stability in Iraq? The short answer is really to find some kind of resolution of US-Iranian relations, to find some kind of stability in that relationship. Because so long as the US and Iran are taking out, or having their discussions and their dialogues, not really discussions and dialogues, but on Iraqi territory or in Syria, it's going to be detrimental to the security and the stability of Iraq. in other countries in the region. And the key part that Iraq can play in this that's quite different than other countries is that Iraq has, as President Saad also mentioned, a very good or a very unique relationship with Iran. It's different than the relationship of other countries in the region. And so it can play a role in being a mediator or part of the dialogue or the diplomacy that happens between the US and Iran. And this isn't just, as people think, Iraq's Shia political faction. It also includes other political factions, including the Iraqi Kurds, who have a working relationship with Iran. So there's all this potential that can be harnessed towards mediation, towards dialogue, towards a resolution of the conflict that has played out on non-Iranian and non-American soil. And as Suzanne Maloney said on Monday, the priority of the Biden administration in the relationship with Iran is to work through diplomacy. And I think Iraq can play a major part in that diplomacy. I'll stop here for now.
Thank you very much. Those are great beginnings from all of you. I want to pick up on the Iran question because you've all mentioned it in different contexts. If for those of you in the audience who have heard Secretary Esper before this, he said a priority for the United States should be getting all U.S. regional allies to work together against Iran. And in very different ways, Iran is active in all three conflicts. And as I'm sure everyone knows, the United States recently, in response to attacks on U.S. contractors in Iraq, attacked Iranian-linked groups in Syria, right? So these conflicts are very much overlapping. And Marcin, I think I'll start with you because you were ending on the Iran point. Can you talk a little bit more about what Iran's influence is in Iraq? How much does Iran control things? We hear very different kind of descriptions of this, but also is there an effective way for the United States to push back on this? And if so, how much should the United States do this?
Yeah, so the relationship between Iran and Iraq needs to be looked at through a historical lens and through the fact that they're neighbors with a very long border and, cultural, religious affinity in some ways. So I think there needs to be a separation from the expectations of that of the relationship Iraq can have with Iran that the outside world or foreign powers have towards Iran and Iraq, and then reasonable explanations that work towards Iraqi sovereignty, in which Iraqi sovereignty is preserved from all foreign intervention. So in terms of Iranian influence in Iraq, there's been an increasing rhetoric from analysts, from people who write about the relationship, that we really need to take a more pragmatic view and to understand certain things like economic ties or the fact that Iraq has to buy import gas from Iran and the like are things that are unavoidable due to the fact that Iraq really doesn't have capacity for a lot of things at the moment. At the same time, there is a lot of foreign intervention in Iraq generally, not just Iran, but including Turkish intervention in Iraq that happens. And so it really is more about preserving Iraqi sovereignty than about pointing fingers at a particular actor. In terms of, intervention in through what people often point out is militias, the rhetoric I think that really needs to be straightened out is to really analyze groups without having a umbrella view towards all of them, and to really understand which groups are part of the Iraqi state, which groups are non-state actors, which actually receive foreign funding and from who and why. I think just a lot of nuance needs to be applied to the Iraq-Iranian relationship, not just from analysts, but critically from people working in policy and designing policy, because I think that goes a long way in being able to identify what is normal influence and what is undue influence on a country.
Jumana, can I ask you a variant of that question, which is, again, how much influence does Iran exercise in Syria? But let me kind of give you two very different scenarios, right? One is arguably Iran saved the Syrian regime. Its back was to the wall. The Iranians were there. They came early. They brought Hezbollah and a whole bunch of Shia foreign fighters along and were very effective and were loyal. The other is that was yesterday. And these are very cynical regimes. And the Syrians have also been having at least limited ties to some of the Gulf states. They have a problem with Turkey, which is in a somewhat hostile relation with the Gulf states. And that normalization in the Arab world will actually require the Syrian regime to move away from Iran, at least to some degree. Can you give a sense of how you feel what the Syria-Iran trajectory is? And then again, the US question, given that this is a priority of the United States to kind of weaken Iranian influence in the region, are there things that you feel the United States should be doing to kind of encourage this?
Well, these are all good questions, Dan. Listen, on the, of course, you would say that, that was yesterday, but I most definitely don't think Iran views it that way. I definitely think that Iran has much more sway over the actions of the Syrian regime than Russia does, although Russia is sort of the less toxic, more agreeable face of the regime on the international stage. I think people sometimes don't quantify how involved the Iranians have been inside of Syria. There are estimates that over 60,000 Iranian-backed militias have been in Syria since the beginning. That's almost the largest foreign invasion of any army, barring the US Army in Iraq, in that neighborhood. It's not a small number. And that number, and there are people who obviously follow militia movements much closer than I, so I won't claim to be an expert on that. But what we have seen is that in many places in Syria, those militias didn't just come and sort of, pass through and leave. Many of them have established bases, much like the one that was hit last night outside of Al-Bukamal. But they have also established bases throughout, including in Homs, in other places in the east, on Israel's border. There's a certain distance away from Israel, but obviously the Israelis keep hitting certain targets because the Iranians are very much keen on entrenching their presence further. Now add to this the societal component, and Iran is, has a past history of doing this. Lebanon is a perfect example. Hezbollah grew from a very small group into what is arguably the most powerful group inside of Lebanon today. And so it's sort of creating these parallel institutions within regimes is something that Iran has actually mastered. And it's part of what has made it very successful in its strategy in the region. Now it is, it has opened schools, universities. There are these Tashayyu centers where it tries to convert people to Shiism, but even barring the conversion factor, it is doing what it does best. Like I said, similar to what it does in Lebanon, which is step in and provide those services that are badly needed, so long as militias are allowed to be present and its military presence is tolerated. So I actually don't think it's up to the Syrian regime how Iran acts moving forward. You were asking me, sorry, I've lost sight of the second question that you...
It's about whether the US can push things in one direction or another.
Sure. Listen, I think there's been a lot of talk about a parallel track to the JCPOA that's been debated. But I think, we've seen both in your conference and from other, for example, Israeli experts and other folks in the region that they actually possibly don't want to negotiate targeting Iran's activity, militia activity and regional activity outside of the nuclear, the nuclear talks. And I think that may allow for opportunities like we saw last night to hit, I think, important sites that can deter Iran from establishing bases or feeling comfortable to establish bases moving forward, as long as they're, limited, very limited strikes, or limited pushback on that activity. I think that kind of deterrence can go a long way. I think the Israelis are already doing it, and we obviously did it last night.
Thank you, that's great. Greg, if I can shift over to you with regard to Yemen. One of the arguments for intervention in Yemen that Saudi Arabia and the UAE made was the Iranians are there and we need to push back against them. They're getting another capital in addition to Beirut, Damascus, and Tehran itself, and or Baghdad to throw that in as well. And even if you take aside that kind of hyperbolic approach, how much influence do the Iranians wield in Yemen? And then if the Saudis, with US support, actually reduce or even end their role, does this leave the field wide open for Iran?
Yeah, those are two really good questions, Dan. So you're right that Saudi Arabia in March of 2015, this is when the Obama administration was still in office, Saudi Arabia came to the Obama administration and said, we need to go in. We're very concerned about the Houthis. They've just taken the capital in late 2014. We think the Houthis are a proxy of Iran. We're worried about this basically Hezbollah South on our border. So we're going to go in. We're going to push them out. I think that was a very poor misreading of the situation in Yemen by Saudi Arabia. I think a lot of that stretched back into history. The Houthis and Saudi had fought some border skirmishes in 2010 as part of the Houthi wars. I think Mohammed bin Salman, who was the Minister of Defense at the time, was very, very keen on sort of restoring Saudi prestige, and he badly misread the situation in Yemen and what the relationship primarily between the Houthis and Iran was at the time. In fact, when the Houthis went into Sana'a in September of 2014, Iran was very adamant in telling them not to actually go into Sana'a at the time, and the Houthis disregarded that advice from Tehran. So what we've seen over the past 6 years is really the Saudi intervention to prevent the Houthis and Iran growing closer together has actually been a self-fulfilling prophecy, and that is it's done the exact thing that Saudi Arabia wanted to prevent, in that it's driven the Houthis and Iran much, much closer together than they would have been otherwise. The Houthis are Shia, but they're Zaydi Shia. They're not the sort of 12 or Shia that is practiced, or 12 or Shiism that's practiced in Iran and in Iraq and in Lebanon. They're a different strand of Shiism. But what we've seen over the past couple of years in particular is that the Houthis are growing much, much closer to Iran. So in 2019, the Houthis appointed their first ambassador to Tehran. More recently in October of 2020, Iran named an ambassador to Yemen, Hassan Irlu, who's now under U.S. Sanctions. But at the same time, the Houthis have changed some of their religious practices. So things like Ashura, which was never a holiday that was practiced in Yemen, was celebrated in Yemen in Houthi-controlled territories for the first time in 2019. And so I think right now, yes, if Saudi Arabia does step back, there is a concern that, well, this will just leave it wide open for Iran to step in. The Houthis are going to continue to grow closer. I'm not sure I completely buy that argument. And I think this breaks down to whether you consider the Houthis to be a proxy of Iran or whether you consider the Houthis to be an ally of Iran. And I think I consider the Houthis to be much more of an ally than they are a proxy. That is, the Houthis are not going to change what it is that they think is in their best interest to do what's in the best interest of Tehran. The Houthis are very much aware of the geography in which they live. That is far from the borders of Iran, but right on the border with Saudi Arabia. And I think that if there were to be some sort of a settlement to this Saudi-led regional war, then I think there could be a situation in which the Houthis in Iran, while not completely breaking their relationship, the Houthis, remember, when they were completely isolated internationally, it was Iran that supported them, Iran that smuggled missile components to them. There will be a pragmatic view from the Houthis about the neighborhood in which they live.
Thank you. A question where I think I'm going to focus on both Syria and Yemen in this capacity, which is really on the humanitarian tragedy. Understandably, many US policymakers or policymakers around the world are focused on the strategic consequences. But some of the conflicts in the Middle East are among the worst in the world, and hundreds of thousands of people have suffered and continue to suffer. Putting aside the broader strategic picture, are there things that are realistic that other countries should be doing to kind of mitigate the humanitarian situation? And what I'd appreciate from both Greg and Jomana I'll ask you to go first, is really to talk about what you feel the scope of the current humanitarian situation is, and then talk about a few things that might be done. And Greg, I'll ask you the same question when Jomana's done.
Thanks, Dan. I mean, yes, of course, the humanitarian part of this conflict is where we've seen sort of great powers clash and only, further exacerbate the conditions in Syria. I think one of the first immediate things and one of the immediate challenges that the Biden administration is going to face on the Syria file, and this is why I go back to the issue of this being a paradox, is that we want to ignore Syria, but we're going to be challenged by it in a number of ways. And one of that ways is the fact that this July, the final border crossing into Syria from Turkey into Idlib is set to expire. The Russians, yesterday vowed that it's going to be closed, that it will not be permitted to remain open. Obviously, the United States and its allies, primarily the Europeans, have pushed back on this. They've tried to push back on it for the past several years because 4 million people's lives are at stake. And if that border crossing is closed, all aid that the United Nations currently does, including vaccine response, COVID response, including all the many facets of humanitarian aid response, will have to go through Damascus. And I think it's been reported widely now through Human Rights Watch, Chatham House, and others, how challenging of a situation that's going to be. I mean, the UN, because of its own mandate, is required to operate under and by the mercy of the Syrian regime. The Syrian regime has absolutely politicized and utilized the United Nations to serve its own aims in terms of picking and choosing which areas it rehabilitates, where it provides aid to. It's mostly going to loyalists, and it's strategically depriving anyone who might have opposed the regime before. And so this is going to be the first challenge. And I think it's something that the US should really fight for very much. They should find a way to negotiate with Russia, a way to keep it open. And they should also, and this is something that I've heard from several people who have worked inside of the UN, develop a standards, sort of a list of standards that we will not continue to support the UN in the fashion we have been if aid is not being delivered in a humanitarian fashion or in congruence with humanitarian principles. And I think that, we've only seen, I think it's important, very important for us to take that position. I'm someone who's a humanitarian. I'm never in favor of cutting off any kind of humanitarian aid or threatening to cut it off. But the problem is the humanitarian aid here has been used as a political tool by the other side. And I think we need to, stop being naive about this and confronting it directly, and in hopes that this could help us negotiate a better outcome where humanitarian aid is still delivered. I think the other way, just for more broadly for your question, in terms of supporting civilians and citizens in the region, and specifically in Syria on this, President Donald Trump cut off the stabilization aid that was going to parts of Syria, North Syria, that are outside of the regime's control. And this has, really, in terms of our counterterrorism efforts and in terms of our ability to help establish local governance mechanisms, it has really hurt them. Many of these, media organizations and local governance councils, et cetera, were being funded and supported by us and the Europeans, especially in Idlib. And in 2017, that aid was cut off. And that has really left a lot of civilian actors who we would like to step up and to push back on these, on whether terrorists, whether it's HTS or Hezbollah or otherwise, we want them to be able to step up and push back on their own without our assistance. But they do need some support in terms of being able to establish themselves. And I think it was a very counterproductive move that President Trump did at the time. And I hope that that's something that, this administration will take to heart. I think those kinds of initiatives are also translatable in the Lebanon context, or can be, as well as in, possibly Yemen and Iraq, which I will, leave for Gregory and Marcin to address. But these are some of the things that I think should be revisited by this administration.
Thank you. Before I turn it over to Greg, I should have noted that we're going to have the last 10 minutes be questions from our audience, and please submit them via Twitter to hashtag US Middle East. Okay, Greg, really the same question to you as applied to Yemen.
Yeah, so I'll just give you sort of three brief aspects on the humanitarian situation in Yemen and then talk about what can be done. So the UN calls Yemen the world's worst humanitarian crisis, I think with good reason. Yemen's economy is broken. So in 2016, President Hadi, against the advice of almost the entire international community, most international observers, split Yemen's central bank. So he basically took the central bank out of Sana'a and reestablished it in Aden. But when you break something that does not work particularly well to begin with, instead of having one functioning piece and one non-functioning piece, you have two not functioning pieces. And that's the situation right now. So Yemen has two economies. Over the course of the war, the Yemeni rial has lost a significant amount of its value. So that means that people's salaries have stayed the same, but of course they're able to buy much, much less. And this is driving a lot of the food crisis in Yemen. People can no longer afford food. They're going into debt to pay for food. There's not enough medicine and not enough food getting into the country because the Saudi-led coalition has the idea that if they can sort of make the situation in northern Yemen so miserable that people will rise up against the Houthis, that of course has not happened because the Houthis basically get a pass on governance while Saudi Arabia is carrying out its bombing campaign. The Trump administration, similar to what Jomana just mentioned with regards to Syria, made a number of missteps in Yemen. That is, the Trump administration cut off aid that was going into Houthi-controlled territories because the Trump administration said, and the Trump administration was right, that the Houthis are manipulating this aid. The Houthis are using this aid to strengthen their own political allies on the ground. And they're basically using the Yemeni civilians under their control as a political pawn. The Trump administration did something similar by designating on their last full day of office, January 19, 2021, that the Houthis are a foreign terrorist organization. That, of course, raised serious questions because once you have a group that is basically in control of a state or is acting like a state and has control of a portion of the country in which 60 to 70% of the population lives, then you're all of a sudden putting the brakes on commercial importers that are bringing in food. So not only now do you have an economic crisis in the north, but now you have a shortages of food, shortages of medicine. And it should be pointed out that the FTO designation, the Trump administration pulling out humanitarian aid from the north, none of this is impacting the Houthi leadership. The Houthi leadership is insulated from these sorts of decisions. They have enough food. They have enough medicine. They're at the top of the social pyramid right now in the north. The people who are suffering from this are the Yemeni civilians who are living under Houthi control. The third aspect of the humanitarian crisis is what we're seeing right now in Marib. Marib is a city in the east of Sana'a. It's up in the north. It's under control of Hadi's government. The Houthis have been on a military offensive, a particularly violent one, really throughout the month of February, and they're trying to seize Marib. Now, the reason that they're trying to take Marib is that Marib, Shabwa, and Hadramaut, these are in the east of Yemen. This is where the vast majority of Yemen's natural resources, the oil and the gas fields, are. So the Houthis have control of a portion of Yemen that has most of the population, 60 to 70%, but they don't have any of the natural resources, any of the exports. So in order to have any sort of long-term stability in the north, the Houthis need to get their hands on some of Yemen's economic resources. This is driving their military offensive in the north. But the humanitarian situation is that there have been a number of people that have fled Houthi-controlled territories over the past six years that are now IDPs in Marib. As this fighting is going on, those IDPs are now moving to other areas of the country, moving into Hadramaut or moving into Shabwa or moving into other places in the south. And that's having a knock-on effect because in most places within Yemen, services are particularly poor. The political situation is so unstable that to have this influx of IDPs is going to destabilize an already very, very shaky situation in the south. So that's just a quick snapshot of three aspects of what the UN calls the world's worst humanitarian crisis. What can be done about this? First and foremost, I think the US can use its leverage, which it's doing right now, to end the Saudi-led regional war. Because once you end that war, then the sort of some of the limitations on what's able to be brought into the country will open back up. Right now, for instance, the Houthis control the port of Hodeidah on the Red Sea coast. In order to bring shipments into there, most ships have to dock twice. They have to go through the UN UNVIM, which is the UN inspection mechanism in Hudaydah. But because the Saudis don't particularly trust UNVIM, they often have to dock in Saudi Arabia. And this causes a number of delays in getting food shipments. The Saudis often turn back ships. Insurance premiums are very, very high. So just ending this Saudi-led war, even if you don't end the civil war, will go a long way to reducing the impact of the humanitarian crisis, which is really, it's completely man-made, and it's costing thousands and thousands of lives in Yemen, and it can be fairly easily solved.
Thank you. I want to shift our focus a little bit. Most of what I've been asking all of you is really about governments and how the United States can change government policies. But I want to shift to really talk about civic leaders. And there are many people in the Middle East who are trying outside the government to make their countries better places, whether in a human rights sense or in a humanitarian sense. And are there things that the United States can be doing to support those people? Marcin, can I begin with you to talk about Iraq?
Yeah, so Iraq's civic leaders, I'd say we have a small contingency of what we call scholars and analysts who, keep the world informed, whether in Washington or in London and the like. But I would say Iraq's strongest civic leaders and the ones that would be most accepted by the Iraqi public are going to be the ones who are in Iraq. And one of the issues that we faced with Iraq, unfortunately, since 2003 is that there really hasn't been a lot of charismatic leadership that can pull the country together and have a unifying nationalistic message. And for that reason, we've oftentimes had to look towards what would appear to be non-traditional leaders in times of crises. So for that reason, that's why frequently, anytime something would happen in Iraq or there would be moments of instability, the Iraqi public would look towards a local figure with authority. And that would usually be Grand Ayatollah Sistani in Iraq, who's had a long history of being asked to get involved. Most recently, through the sermons of his representatives to the protest movement that happened. As for what the US can do, generally, I think there's two things that pour towards democratization ultimately in a country, and that's education and freedom of speech and the ability to operate. And so with regards to education, I think one of the domains in which the international community can help Iraq is to promote its education, which has been lagging in the last few years, and which really is going to set a standard for its future, and it's going to determine its future leadership and its future civic leaders. And so I think to develop leadership, we really need to have an investment in education. And that happens to be an uncontroversial field to promote, particularly since we have a lack of schools here. Students, particularly in the South, which had a lot of protests in the past, due to protests and COVID, had missed an entire year of schooling. So that's one of the things that I think goes towards leadership. And the other thing is freedom of speech and freedom to operate. And unfortunately, we see that to be a bit on the decline in Iraq lately. Immediately after 2003, we had this dramatic shift from a totalitarian state in which you couldn't voice an opinion on anything, and then to a sudden freedom to say what you wanted to say. I mean, to this day, you can go around in Iraq and say things about the prime minister if you want. But there's a tightening of space. And that's unfortunate to see. And I think what the world can do and what the United States can do to promote more freedom of speech in Iraq is to let Iraq be stable, because there's space to nurture freedoms and space to nurture democracy when there isn't always fear of security and when there's a sense of ownership of the state.
Thank you. Jemana, can you talk about this question, but in the context of Syria, where given the nature of the regime and the kind of divided nature of sovereignty in the country, the circumstances are so different?
Sure. I mean, I think I do think there are Syrian leaders, but I most definitely think in regime-held areas, we're not going to know them. We're not going to know, we're not going to see their faces for their own safety. But I think that there are many issues that the intra-Syrian community is grappling with, right? One of them is that, does the opposition actually represent the people who it claims to represent? we know that Bashar al-Assad doesn't fully represent everyone under his control, but can we say the same about the opposition, who actually doesn't even control lands fully? And so there's a disconnect there that we have to be honest about. But also, and I heard one time an Iraqi scholar say this, and it's resonated with me ever since, is that, a democracy cannot be established by non-democratic actors. And I think so many of the individuals that have worked on the Syria context that are Syrian, whether you say they're opposition leaders, government leaders, et cetera, many of them are not people who are, deeply devoted to democracy and democratic principles and liberal democracy in particular. And so I do think on some ways, as much as difficult as it is for me to say this, that some of this will require time and evolution of a stable opposition, for example, that can come into government with a clear, party idea and values, and it has the ability to rally people behind it. I have yet to see such a holistic movement come out in the wake of the Syrian conflict. I definitely have hope for something like that appearing, but we have yet to see something like that at this current moment. But in terms of what we can do about it, I wholeheartedly agree with Marcine's recommendation, especially on the education part. And this is something that many of us have brought to the attention of the US government and the Europeans, is that there's actually funding for education has been largely halted over the past several years. And this is incredibly problematic because you have children in Syria, hundreds of thousands of children inside of Syria that have never stepped foot in a classroom, that are borderline illiterate, if not fully. And so, I remember a colleague of mine in the wake of the 2003 Iraq invasion that said, even after, everyone left or the Americans left, there weren't Iraqis there who were educated enough to rebuild it in the same way. And they warned us that make sure that you are not losing sight of preparing a workforce that will need to be there, that there will be the only people who want to be there the day after to help rebuild. And so I think, cutting off education aid has had dire consequences for the Syrian people. And that's one thing that I think our policymakers can in the immediate term address. In addition to, I think, what Marcine was saying about, identifying people who may, who may be able to groom, become leaders in the future, and at least help them have access to opportunities locally to help strengthen their ability to, rally people behind their vision and really established, firm movements that are long lasting.
Thank you, and thank you all very much. We've gotten some excellent questions from our audience, and I want to bring some of them in. Greg, I want to start with you. One of our audience members raised the point that with Biden's executive order and other measures to end the U.S. role in Yemen, or end the U.S. support for Saudi Arabia's role in Yemen, the U.S. is effectively cutting off its own influence. That this is, what it means is the United States may want to change things in Yemen, but no longer has any kind of dog, if you will, in the fight, and any ability to do things. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Saudi Arabia needed U.S. acquiescence to go into Yemen in 2015. If the audience will remember, Saudi Arabia actually did a very odd thing, which is they announced the beginning of the war in Yemen not from Riyadh, but they announced it actually from D.C. And they wanted the U.S. to actually sign off on going in. I think that what the Biden administration has done is actually the right thing. The Biden administration, I think, has made it very clear, made three things very, very clear to Saudi Arabia. That is, U.S. support for this war is going to end. The war itself must end, and the U.S. is going to do everything in its power to make sure that Saudi Arabia, its territory, its borders are secure, and that it can work on some sort of a successful peace negotiation. Now, the trick there is that the U.S. has significant leverage with Saudi Arabia and the Saudi-led coalition. The U.S. has very limited leverage, almost no leverage with the Houthis. So, and right now the Houthis feel as though they are in the strongest position, because they feel, We've kept the capital. We've survived 6 successive years of war, and these airstrikes have done nothing to dislodge us. In fact, if anything, we're much stronger now than when the war began. And the Houthis are not about to give up at the negotiating table what it is that they feel that they've won on the battlefield. So getting Saudi Arabia to stop the war is something that's in the US power. Getting some sort of a negotiated peace settlement between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis is going to be much, much trickier. I think the US has some tools at its disposal, both carrots and sticks that it can use. Sanctions are one, although the way that UN and US sanctions have been put in place in Yemen has not worked particularly well. But I think there are steps the US has that I think the Biden administration is well aware of that it can use to, at this late date, create leverage with the Houthis.
Thank you. Another audience member asked a question about an important actor in the region we haven't talked about that much, which are the Kurds. Marcin, you mentioned this briefly in your remarks. But if I can ask you, Marcin, to kind of discuss what you feel should be the role of the Kurds in Iraq, not just within Iraq itself, but in terms of how other powers should be approaching them. Should this be something that there's been a special relationship between the United States and Kurdish leaders for decades now? How should this change in a way that would be best for Iraq?
I think this is part of a broader issue in Iraq that has been needed to be addressed for quite a while now, and that's the issue of having a national dialogue amongst Iraq's various ethnic and religious groups. Obviously, the Kurds are a very large ethnic group in Iraq. They have a semi-autonomous region with their own with their own parliament and with their own government. That being said, like the rest of Iraq, the Kurdistan region of Iraq has gone through its own set of crises and problems, including protests recently, much like happened in South and South Central Iraq. And the reason I point this out is because I think also, as President Saleh said on Wednesday, at some point we really need to have a national dialogue about the way the Iraqi state looks and how different groups belong and what role they have in it. It's a very tricky question because when you have foreign ties that are directly tied or directly targeted towards one subset of a country, that in a way takes away from the sovereignty of the country as a whole. And this is particularly problematic if you think about the way that the Kurdistan regional government has been ruled for years, and that it really hasn't been democratic in the full sense of the term. It's been led by essentially the same parties for years now. And so I think the better way for any international actor to actually engage with the Kurdish people is for first Iraq and for any other country that, well, I'm only going to speak about Iraq because it's the one that concerns me most now, is to have a genuine national dialogue about what it means to be Iraqi, what the relationship should be like between Erbil and Baghdad. There's a lot of dissatisfaction on both sides. But I think when you approach the Kurdistan region through its people, rather than just assuming that the actions of the governments, both in Baghdad and Erbil, are reflective of the will of the people, I think that would help. And like I said, it's part of this bigger problem we have of having to go through these crises and never having a time for national dialogue. I mean, Ba'ath ended, and we never really had a dialogue about what post-Ba'athist Iraq looks like and what happens to people who are implicated in the former regime. We sort of just trudged on, and then we had a sectarian war and did the very same thing without thinking about what it means. And the problem now is that we might do the same. We look like we're about to do the same with the Daesh war. Oh, I'm sorry, that was the end of my comments there.
I apologize. Giovanna, we have a few minutes left. I wanted to ask you a similar question about the Kurds in Syria, but with the recognition that it's a much smaller community in terms of percent of the whole, but at the same time, a tremendously important one from the point of view, especially of the US military, but more broadly for kind of US policy in general in terms of some very specific US objectives.
Sure. I couldn't have said it better. I mean, I think they the brilliance of the Kurds is that they've been able to, especially through helping us, by being really the ground force in terms of the war on ISIS, have proven themselves really quite capable of helping us even achieve our own goals on the ground. And they've managed to now hold about 30% of Syrian land. Now, that doesn't mean it's held by one faction of the Kurds, or that everything they control in that area is only Kurds. There are most definitely some Arabs that are a large proportion, of Arabs who live in those areas. But like Marcin said, I think also in the Syria case, the issues of what a Syrian is, who is a Syrian, is Syria an Arab, it's called the Syrian Arab Republic. Believe it or not, the word Arab in the title of the state has caused, massive debates among, in Syria between opposition and government, and other circles. And so, the place of Kurds as being part of the Syrian state is something that I think is yet to be determined. We haven't even had a moment to catch up to think about that. The Kurds are very clear in terms of wanting some kind of autonomy in Syria. They've tried to negotiate that. They haven't. I'm getting a little distracted by all the, by all the pictures, but they have, fought to really delineate some of those borders in their favor post the defeat of ISIS. And I think now the challenge is going to be to decide whether or not, or to be able to see whether or not they strike some kind of a deal with the regime, which is, it's always possible. Although at this point, we haven't seen momentum for that, or if they're going to remain sort of their own enclave in the Northeast, playing an important role in withholding some resources from the regime and keeping some, space where, some free space may still be available in North Syria outside of the regime's hands. So I'll stop there.
Jamal, that's a great way to end. Thank you so much. It's really been a fantastic panel, and I'd like to thank Marcin, Greg, and Jumana for really fantastic presentations that have made us all a lot smarter. We're going to take a little break now, but please, everyone, stay around for our next panel. It's going to be fantastic on broader lessons learned and how the Biden administration should be approaching the Middle East. So thank you very much again to our panel, and I look forward to the next one coming along. Thank you.
Great. All right, thanks.
Good afternoon and good evening to everyone joining us from the region, and welcome again to our very final panel of this conference, this week-long conference at Brookings on the Middle East and the new US administration. Thank you all very much for joining us throughout the week for a very varied and I think very rich program. We look forward to following up with a lot more programming. I'm delighted to be joined with colleagues of mine from Brookings to discuss a few of the lessons learned from this week and also discuss things that we did not cover in our public program. As I said in the very first panel, obviously given the limited time and scheduling reasons, we were not able to discuss all countries or all issues, and we hope to at least touch on them today very briefly, although we'll of course have a lot more research and programming on that in the future. I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. and Professor Shibli Terhami of Brookings and the University of Maryland, by Tamara Kaufman-Wittes, Dr. Tamara Kaufman-Wittes as well, from the Brookings Institution, from our center, Dr. Shadi Hamid from our center as well, and later we'll be joined by Bruce Rydell as well. My name is Nathan Sachs, and I'm the director of the center. So I'd like to first just start out with an open sort of question to all of you, and Shibli, I'll start with you if that's okay. Things that stood out by their absence this week in all the various conversations, including the one you had with Anwar Gargash, but others as well.
Thank you, Nathan. Good show this week. I know that there were a lot of issues that weren't covered. A lot of people were not represented, but the cluster was very important, and it led to really important conversations on key issues. One of the things that was striking to me is the conversations about Iran. Obviously, we've had multiple issues because that is a weighty question that is facing the administration at the moment. But it was striking to me that there were differences, particularly between the Israeli representatives and what we were hearing from the Gulf region. It's something that I had certainly noticed in the past, something I've written about before. While Israel and the Gulf Arab states have an interest in containing Iran, a very substantial interest for both of them, they're not identical in interest. And so it was striking to me on the Israeli side that the focus on the military option was prominent, not just by one of the candidates, obviously, Gideon Sar, who obviously said very openly, essentially, that Israel should consider a military option, even if the US opposes it. But even in the discourse of think tankers, where you hear there has to be a credible military option. And that kind of, for me, that was striking, where the Israelis are still focused on that, given where the Biden administration is. But more importantly, because I have a good memory of what happened under the Obama administration. I wrote a piece on this in 2015 in Reuters about how Bibi Netanyahu was trying to show that his threat to attack the Iranian nuclear facility was credible, to urge Obama essentially to act. Initially, the Obama administration didn't take him very seriously. They didn't think this was a credible threat for analytical reasons. They thought it was just a kind of a pressure tactic. But then Netanyahu undertook some measures, including investing huge amounts of money to make the threat credible to the Obama administration. But that got him exactly the opposite of what he wanted. Instead of the administration focusing on a military option, they saw this as an attempt to drag them into a war they didn't want. They made the Iran nuclear issue a top issue, aside from all of the other regional policies that Iran has, and made it the Iran nuclear deal that emerged a top priority in order not to be dragged into a war. So it is kind of interesting to me that the discourse in Israel hasn't changed much, even without Netanyahu and others in the political discourse, still focused on this credibility of the military option. Contrast that with what we heard from people in the UAE, including Gargash that I interviewed, who sounded more like where the Obama administration was. It certainly didn't sound that way when Trump was in office, for sure, but clearly part of their attempt to get closer to the Biden administration. And one of the things that was clear is that they would be fine if there was a immediate return to the JCPOA, as long as then as a credible negotiation on things like conventional weapons, Iranian meddling, other issues. We also heard from Kitbi, another UAE think tanker who's close to the authorities, who said, well, you know, Iran wouldn't use its nuclear weapons. These are only deterrence weapons. Their issue wasn't so much the nuclear issue. This has been kind of projected. Of course, the Gulf Arab states are more worried about the conventional capabilities of Iran, as well as Iranian influence, as well as Iranian meddling in Arab affairs, and less focused on the nuclear issue, in contrast to the Israelis. And I wonder how this is going to play itself out in coordinating their relationship with the Biden administration moving forward.
Thanks. Tamara, when I turn to you also for sort of the general question, we'll have opportunity also to discuss and relate to other things that people said, but things that stood out to you, struck you, perhaps surprised you?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, just on Shibley's point, I think that the fact that this new coalition in the region has a strong sense of shared threat, but a very different set of priorities, is something that we need to keep paying attention to. And it actually offers certain kinds of opportunities for the Biden administration. If, for example, you have all of the Gulf states more focused on Iran's missile program. How do you leverage that in the Security Council to push on that issue, which I think needs a lot of attention. You also actually have more consensus today amongst America's various partners on the need for the nuclear diplomacy to be on a separate track from the diplomacy addressing other dimensions of the Iranian challenge. Back when President Obama was negotiating the JCPOA, that was a bone of contention in the region with the United States approach. So it's interesting where we've come together and where we've come apart. I think overarching the theme across so many of the regional actors that we spoke to this week was diplomacy, hearing the Biden administration's commitment to putting diplomacy first. And as Shibley noted in his interview with Anwar Gargash, the region itself is looking to de-escalate after 10 years in which a lot of regional actors have been very forward-leaning in using military tools and other coercive tools rather than diplomacy themselves. This then begs the question, are these states in the region who have been trying to press their power advantage through military tools, are they ready for diplomacy? Do they have the capacity to engage in effective diplomacy with one another, as well as with the United States and Europe and other crucial external actors? And I think that it's a very different set of governments in the region who have their diplomatic toolbox well developed than who have their military toolbox well developed. So some governments in the region are going to need to up their diplomatic game. That's one thing that occurred to me. The other thing that occurred to me listening to all this is just how far apart some of the regional actors are on the conflicts that the Biden administration wants to make progress on resolving. Israelis and Palestinians listening to Gideon Sa'ar say, oh no, annexation is still very much in Israel's national interest. Listening to Salam Fayyad question whether the PLO's historic compromise on the 1967 lines is still in the Palestinian interest, to me really drove home just how much the fundamentals of Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking have been overturned and how much work there is to do to get the parties back to a baseline where they can begin to negotiate effectively with one another. That was very sobering. And I think that the Biden administration, is not necessarily intent on investing a huge amount of time into diplomacy on Israel-Palestine, on Libya, on Syria, on Yemen. And yet it's clear that diplomacy takes a lot more time than other foreign policy tools. And that leaves a lot more room for second guessing and nitpicking and spoilers. And so it requires more commitment in certain ways than other foreign policy tools. So that just drove home to me the nature of the challenge. Even if all the parties in the region agree on the need for conflict resolution, what it takes to get from point A to point B.
Thank you. Shadi, some lessons learned, something that stood out for you?
Yeah, thanks, Natan. So if I had to sum up the conversations, what I would say is that there was a very strong emphasis on the U.S. managing conflict and preventing bad things from happening, preventing worst case scenarios. So there was a sense that the U.S. is playing, in some sense, a blocking role. Democracy and human rights did come up a number of times, but in a very limited way. That's probably not surprising, but it is somewhat in contrast to how Biden, at least in some of his initial remarks since he's become president, has emphasized what makes him different than Trump. And one of those things is this stronger emphasis on supporting democracy abroad. But obviously supporting democracy abroad and supporting democracy in the Middle East aren't always the same things. And I think what we got a sense from a number of people who spoke this week, whether it was Gregory Meeks or Mark Esper and so on, is that human rights will come up in bilateral conversations, and there will be a desire to at least bring it up in a way that perhaps hadn't happened before under Trump. But it's unclear to me how much further it goes beyond that. So it's countering worst excesses of, say, Saudi Arabia or Egypt, but there isn't really a strong affirmative vision for how we can be more engaged and how we can go beyond just, encouraging Saudi Arabia to be a little bit less repressive. That's good. That's better than what we had before, in my view, but it's not a particularly ambitious vision. And it's almost as if, I would say, that the Arab Spring never happened. You could have listened to many of these conversations, perhaps with the exception of the Algerian foreign minister, in part because Algeria is going through the kind of second iteration of the Arab Spring. But with that notable exception, there's a desire to move beyond and to not necessarily forget, but there's certainly a sense that the Arab Spring isn't particularly relevant today. And that's understandable, certainly. I mean, the Middle East is still quite depressing. There's several ongoing civil conflicts and civil wars. I think from the US perspective, we also have the misfortune of having, shall we say, bad allies that are sometimes reckless, sometimes very much contrary to both our ideals and interests. So I think from how the Biden administration looks at it then is that there's not a lot we can do that's very positive. We can't be particularly transformational. We have to deal with the world as it is. And also, I would say there is this sense of exhaustion with the Middle East. I don't want to overstate the whole, there was a political article that was brought up by some speakers that came out at the start of the week about how much the Biden administration is deprioritizing the Middle East. We can debate, how accurate that perspective is, but there's no doubt that there's a kind of exhaustion when you hear people talk about the Middle East in this administration, or even in Washington, D.C. more broadly. There's a sense that the Middle East is a nuisance. It's a problem to manage. People are fighting all the time, and the best we can do is make them fight a little bit less. Maybe the last thing I would say is that, and I didn't catch every single session, but the ones that I did see, the ones I did watch, religion did not really come up. And that's striking to me because I'm generally someone who's seen the role of Islam in public life as being one of the primary foundational divides in the Middle East. And the fact that many people don't really have much to say about that and don't even really want to talk about it. It's almost being put to the side as something, it's at some level, the US is not good at dealing with religion abroad, but at the same time, it is a reality. It is a point of conflict in a number of different countries. And if we don't have anything to say about that, or we don't have any way to incorporate that into our policy analysis and in our policy recommendations, I think we're going to be at a bit of a loss. So those are just some of the things that stood out to me.
Great, thank you. Bruce, I wonder anything that stood out to you from all the conversations, including yours with the ambassador, but anything else as well?
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Good. First of all, thanks to you, Nathan. Pulling together a conference like this anytime is a monumental, difficult task. Trying to do it on Zoom can only be 10 times more difficult. So thank you. I'm in violent agreement with Shadi. I am struck by the lack of ambition, the slowness. This administration understandably has other bigger priorities, especially the president. But the Secretary of State doesn't have other bigger priorities. This is his priority, working on foreign policy. And I fully agree with Shadi too. The Middle East is regarded as a nuisance. I would have used a much stronger word. But nuisance is a nice, relatively neutral way to refer to it. I've heard a lot of old thinking repackaged, and they're not Trump, but that's a low bar. That is a very, very low bar, and it's not going to pass the muster, and it's not going to impress people in the region. I'm going to wait and hear who this entity is that's going to be sanctioned to put pressure on MBS, but I don't think what I heard today is going to pass the mustard on the Hill, and I can assure you it's not going to pass the mustard with the Washington Post, which is not going to say this is a satisfactory response. I also heard very bad analysis of the situation in Saudi Arabia, pathetically bad analysis. The Crown Prince's position is not firm. He's not going to be on the throne for decades to come. That's his propaganda. That's listening to Ali Shahabi. If that's what our embassy is reporting, then we need to get a new embassy out there very, very quickly.
So,
more broad, my second point was actually a question raised by Tracy in the last session. The era of oil is over. It's over. And it's going to be coming to a complete end much faster. It's not 30 years from now. It's going to be much faster than that. In 10 years, most cars in America will be driven on electricity. The Pentagon is going to make that happen. The Pentagon is about to say that all new vehicles the Pentagon buys has to be electrical cars. That means the biggest purchaser of vehicles in the United States is going to say fossil fuels are finished. That has profound meaning for this region. Tracy nicely said it's one of the things that Middle East exports. Get real. It is the only thing the Middle East exports aside from terrorism. This is a huge, huge thing. And it's hard to get our heads wrapped around it, but it has enormous implications. And they're not good. They're not good implications.
Thank you. So I wonder, I'll chime in. I think I have a slightly different take, I have to say, from Shadi and Bruce. I do hear sort of humble expectations or low expectations from many of the people we heard this week. And I think we hear that in Washington too. And in some ways, I think it's actually rather healthy. This administration is coming after 3 very, very different administrations with a lot of whiplash between them, from George W. Bush to Obama, then to Trump, each one very different from the other. It's not even that they're Republicans on one side and Democrat on the other. And I think a bit like domestically, where Biden comes in with a sense of predictability and a sense of trying to project unity, I think it's important for our partners in the region also to remember, to understand where America stands with low and even humble expectations of what it can achieve, given the fact the United States is not willing to commit the resources that it did, say, under George W. Bush. And I think that's in many regards. To me, I'm sort of struck, especially on the Iranian question, which is very central and was very central to many of our conversations. First, on things that Shibli and Tamara said, I agree. A panel I moderated on Iran, we heard significant differences between Israeli voices and Emirati voices, and of course, European voices. But I'm also struck by a change in Washington. We heard it from Suzanne, echoing things that we hear in Washington, but we heard it from others as well. There is a movement in Washington, I think, a bit more towards the position of the regional partners, quite different, at least so far in the first month of the Biden administration, quite different from where Obama ended up. We saw that with the announcement of the resumption of the strategic forum between Israel and the United States, and that's significant. I am, though, struck, how long will that last? At the end of the day, there will be a question of sanction relief. Can that kind of comedy between the United States and partners in the region continue? And especially when there will be, and there probably will be, fundamental differences in actual policy. We're also speaking, of course, just after the first strike by the Biden administration in Syria against targets of militias supported by Iran. And this, all reports suggest that this was carefully chosen to be in Syria, not in Iraq, et cetera, et cetera. And to show, we've heard some voices in the region already pointing out that this shows Biden's willingness to use force in response, at least. It was a very measured use of force. But that, again, to my mind, will be a question going forward. How much will the Biden administration be willing to get involved in such things, especially given the fear of slippery slope?
In fact, I would like to engage that a little bit. I mean, what Shadi said and what Bruce said, but to look at it from a slightly different perspective, which is the location of the whole conversation in comparison to where Middle East experts are. As you know, with Mark Lynch, I did a public opinion survey amongst scholars specializing on the Middle East, mostly members of the American Political Science Association, Middle East Studies Association. And there's certainly a disconnect at some level. For example, on the Arab uprising, to start with one that Shadi mentioned, the overwhelming majority of Middle East scholars, more than 3/4, think either the uprising haven't gone away or they're coming back within the next 10 years. It's not like they're accepting the fact that they've been just put in a bottle by the regimes. That's not the way, at least scholars see it. We could debate that, but these are people who say it's still ongoing or they're coming back. We're not addressing that. Those are important issues that have to be discussed. On things related to U.S. power, I mean, again, maybe here there's more harmony. 75% think US power is weaker than it was 10 years ago, is likely to even be weaker in the future. They think of the Middle East right now in terms of global power as more as sort of multipolar, with no one, including the US, dominating influence in the region. They think on the Iran nuclear issue, the vast majority, 2/3, say the US should join the JCPOA immediately without renegotiation. On Israel-Palestine, the administration is focused on a two-state solution. We're talking about that still. 52% of the scholars think it's no longer possible, and another, large percentage think it's unlikely in the next 10 years. There are a handful of people who think it's still likely in the next 10 years. So there's a little bit of disconnect between where the scholars are and the conversation that is taking place in Washington. It doesn't mean the scholars are always right. We know that there are differences and the scholars could be wrong, but it does strike me that we're, that we have there is still a Washington bubble or policymaking bubble, even beyond Washington, global bubble, that's disconnected from some analytical assessment that is necessary, particularly on the big issues of the day.
Natan, can I jump in on that? I wouldn't disagree with Shibli that there's a bubble in Washington on various issues. And more broadly, I think that Washington tends to fixate on certain issues and give relatively short shrift to others. And Shadi and Bruce, I think, pointed that out very well. So right now, the fixation in the Washington policy conversation is on Iran, and it's a big challenge and a hard one, and there's lots to talk about. But I think that one of the things that's happened over the last decade is that in the analytic community broadly, not just in academic analysis, but that there has grown a greater consensus about the relationship between governance, social cohesion, and stability. When I was writing about the Bush administration's freedom agenda, Middle East Studies was analyzing the durability of Arab authoritarianism. And this week, the same week as our conference, the Rand Corporation released a major study of the Middle East, one of the themes of which is that human security and human development and governance issues are core to the stability of the region. So I hear what Shibli's saying, but I don't think we should overstate the disconnect. I actually think that there is much more consensus today than there ever has been before, including inside the US government, on the need for stability in the region to be thought of not merely in geostrategic terms, but in terms of human security. And the Biden administration so far has sort of talked a good talk on that, but I think we have yet to see how they're going to walk the walk. And I'm curious to watch that.
To me also, there's an interesting question of both goals and means. So on the one hand, you do see, I think, a growing consensus in the United States, and I think certainly all of us at Brookings are party to that, of a need to look at fundamentals. If you think long-term in the Middle East, there are enormous problems that will affect hundreds of millions of people, well beyond the immediate relations between two governments right now. Questions that Bruce raised also of climate change and their effects, but even before climate change, just the lack of basic governance and the lack of economic opportunity, which are enormous and affect huge numbers of people. And that recognition, I think, is extremely important and very welcome to my mind. On the other hand, we also have an era, and we can't ignore it, of the United States willing and perhaps able to commit much fewer resources to change things in the Middle East. And most of these problems that we're talking about do not entail a speech by a principal or a simple decision in the White House. They entail an enormous effort by the United States, and even that would not be enough. Even that would have to be only part, probably a small part, a much broader effort, and most of it organic from within, from the region itself. And so to a certain degree, I'm heartened by the fact that there is, I think, a longer view among many, but I have to say I remain rather pessimistic. Some of the problems are gargantuan and will not be changed certainly by whether Biden decides X, Y, or Z on priority, on a low priority after all. Shadi, you were on the queue already, and Bruce, I'll turn to you right after that.
Yeah, so, on Tamara's point, I remember when I would talk to Obama administration officials in the second term, and they would certainly, from an intellectual standpoint, they would agree with a lot of this idea that governance is important, democracy is in America's long-term interest, because if you include people in the political process, then that can reduce conflict, reduce the resort to violence. So I think that there is an intellectual consensus if you talk to people on a broad level. Also, it's very hard. It's very hard to say that democracy wouldn't be good in the long run. So I think there's also like a natural tendency just to say that. But what I found is that the disconnect was between that intellectual realization on the part of the Obama administration, what they were actually willing to do in terms of policy. And knowing some of the folks who have been appointed to the Biden administration, I know that they personally agree, again, from an intellectual standpoint, democratization is good for stability in the long run. But the fact that that intellectual realization doesn't actually lead to bold policy in that direction, to me, is one of, it's not a puzzle, but it is, in my view, a problem. And this goes, I think, to the question of US power and perceptions of US leverage, because oftentimes the claim was that, yes, this would be nice in theory, but the US doesn't have a lot of power to actually change outcomes in the internal domestic politics of these countries. But, there are certain things, and Bruce has written quite a bit about this. If we wanted to really put pressure on Saudi Arabia, there are things that we could do that wouldn't require an excessive use of US power. In fact, it would require drawing back a little bit. So, for example, suspending the provision of spare parts and maintenance to the Saudi military and to the Air Force in particular, that could ground the Saudi Air Force in fairly short order. Now, that is not something that would be realistically considered by the current Biden administration, just too controversial, and they want to be pragmatic. But theoretically, these things can be done if there was sufficient will. That wouldn't necessarily go beyond the capabilities of US power or US resources.
Tammy used a good phrase. They talk the talk. The question is, can they walk the walk? I would add one other element to that. The time to take bold action in an administration is the first 100 days. After that, the political constraints on you are going to build and build and build and build. And I think they're wasting their time. And particularly, I would say on Iran. A slow dance with the Iranians is going to end up producing an outcome that will be very, very controversial, not just on partisan lines. If you remember back to the JCPOA debate, Obama had a hard time getting the Democratic Party behind it, and in parts of it he never got behind. I think they will rue that they didn't move much faster on a couple of these issues. I would say Iran in particular. They've just built up opposition. They're going to find the Iranians be what the Iranians always are, extremely clever negotiators who know how to bury you in obfuscation and stuff like that. We'll see. Maybe slow and steady will win the race. We'll see.
Great. So I actually find myself more in the slow and steady camp, I have to admit. And we had a very interesting discussion just on this point on how much the United States should take into account the upcoming presidential elections in Iran in May or June. where Suzanne Maloney, our own Suzanne Maloney, was on one side, and some of the other experts, especially Eliger and Maya from ECFR, and another where she advocated taking that very much into account and trying to move fast before that. I'd like to shift to one last sort of topic, and that is to combine things that we didn't cover and that we should, but especially things that are probably not on the radar of the Biden administration. So this is a bit unfair, but I guess that's our job, is to try and think of what we might discuss a year or two from now that we're probably not thinking of too much at the moment. So let's set Iran and Saudi Arabia aside for a moment. What else might we be discussing that is simply not on our plate? Tammy, why don't we start with you for me?
I think there are very few things that are nowhere on the radar of the Biden administration because the US government is large and capable and has specialists on every conceivable issue. The question is whether it gets attention at the highest levels in time to head off negative developments. And, this gets more broadly to the point that Bruce was making, which is that if you don't see over the horizon, you tend to devalue a thing, and then it becomes a crisis and you're forced to deal with it in ways that you wouldn't wish to. I think that is the broad challenge. Whether we're talking about ongoing bottom-up protests across the region, and Shadi's absolutely right. This is a story that we are very much in the middle of, and I don't know where we'll see the end. So things like, politics in Lebanon and Algeria and Iraq that have to remain important considerations and shouldn't be traded off against other conversations that we're having on geopolitical issues in the region. I would say the same thing about the conflict in Syria. We just had this wonderful panel discussion about the challenge of conflict resolution in the region. But, even if it's hard and even if we feel like our leverage is limited, that doesn't mean that we can accept a situation in which a conflict blows up and throws off the negative externalities that we've seen over the last decade. I think one place that I would point to in specific in that regard that we didn't talk about at all this week, I think, but that really needs urgent attention is the Horn of Africa, where we're seeing a number of regional actors, Middle Eastern actors, whether it's Egypt or the UAE, playing a role. There are ongoing conflicts that are already quite bad and could easily get worse, that could impede major American goals like confronting terrorism in the Sahel. And so if our regional partners are truly interested in diplomacy and de-escalation, I would love to see them apply that principle in the Horn with much more alacrity than we've seen so far.
Great, and I'll just plug before turning on. I'll just plug. We've had some great work on this, especially by our former colleague Zach Verton, who has now joined the administration, but also by our colleague Wanda Felber-Brown and Jeff Feltman, of course, who've done excellent work and written on the Horn of Africa. It's a very extremely important issue, considering the number of people also living there and the potential for true catastrophe. But even short of catastrophe, we already have a brewing crisis that really deserves a lot of attention. And I'll just channel one of our colleagues by saying there is a bit of an administrative difficulty because it sort of lies in between the MENA space and the Africa space. And for bureaucracy, that's not always an easy thing to do, to sort of bridge exactly the seams. And so a very important topic to watch. Shadi, over to you. Same question.
Yeah, so Natan, I guess I would say just so people know where I'm coming from, I have a bit of a bias. I don't believe that autocracy can be permanent. By definition, autocracies are temporary because, for a variety of reasons. One of them is just they sort of go contrary to what I consider to be part of the human spirit, which is difficult to extinguish entirely. So what that means, though, is, first of all, what is the long-term perspective? And what do we actually envision the Middle East looking like? Maybe not in 5 years, but in 20 or 30. And I bring this up because I'm skeptical that there will be revolutions or successful uprisings in the near term. I don't think that that's something the Biden administration has to worry about right away, because unfortunately, and I hate to say this, repression can work. Not in the long term, but it can be quite effective in the short to medium term, where you basically rebuild the wall of fear. And folks might remember there was this discourse when the Arab Spring started that Arabs will never go back to the way things were before. The wall of fear has been broken down, but what we realize is that the wall of fear can be rebuilt brick by brick, if you will. And if we look, for example, at Algeria had its military coup in 91, a brutal civil war subsequently. It took Algeria about 25 years to recover, where Algerians were able and willing to go back into the streets. In Syria, after the Hama massacre of 1982, it took about 29 years for Syrians to build back the courage to challenge the Assad regime. What that tells me is that these are basically generational problems. So Egypt, I think, is a disaster waiting to happen, but not right away. But I do think there will come a point where US policymakers will have to pay a little bit more attention to Egypt, because this situation doesn't seem sustainable. But the question is always, when we say that the status quo is unsustainable, which is something that everyone loves saying, and I remember during the second Bush administration in the 2000s, Condoleezza Rice would always say things like, the status quo is untenable, which is true, but the problem is we don't agree when it becomes untenable. So that's where Egypt comes in a bit of a longer term. Tunisia, I may have missed it. I don't think Tunisia really came up. I guess people don't care a whole lot about Tunisia because they see it as being somewhat positive. And we have a bias towards not looking too closely at countries that are doing better than the others, because there's not a huge crisis in Tunisia now, but there are weak points. There are things we have to be worried about. And I would also mention that I don't think that I heard, and as someone who works on the Muslim Brotherhood, I obviously pay more attention to whether the Muslim Brotherhood is mentioned. I think Anwar Gargash mentioned briefly political Islam, but there is a broader context here where we have two blocs in the Middle East. I mean, one of them now is more powerful than the others: Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt to some extent, and in cooperation with Israel. They are what we might call the anti-brotherhood or anti-Islamist bloc, but then you have Qatar and Turkey, which are more sympathetic to the Muslim Brotherhood. And that gets to a bigger conversation around the role of Islam vis-a-vis the state and the state's relationship to Islam. And that still is, I think, a subtext to some of the tensions that we have in the region. I mean, obviously the Qatar crisis has been resolved, well, not completely resolved, but to some extent resolved for now. But what was one thing that was driving that? Fundamentally different conceptions of the relationship between Islam and the state.
Thank you. Bruce, the same question. Issues we're not thinking about at all right now, and maybe high on the Biden administration's agenda in a couple of years.
It's a very good question. I call it the looking for the canary in the mine. Where's the tipping point that starts to show you something's coming? And here's what I think. Lebanon, in many ways, is the canary. It's a small state. It doesn't have any oil, and it was confronting all the problems of the Arab Spring coming home with one of the most corrupt, not just governments, but governing classes. So, where are the other canaries in the Middle East? I would say it's going to be states somewhat similar to Lebanon. Relatively small states that don't have any oil and have too many people. One that comes to my mind right away, Jordan. Jordan, I see the signs of the canary. I see signs there already. COVID covers it up. COVID does a very good job of allowing, COVID is a force multiplier for repression. Because, first of all, nobody in their right mind would go out and get into a demonstration with a lot of other people who don't have any masks on when you know you could die from them breathing on you, let alone the government opening fire on you with machine guns. As COVID eases up in places like Jordan, I think we may start to see more signs of social unrest and unhappiness. COVID has also accelerated the sense that the haves get the vaccine and the have-nots don't get the vaccine. Another place, Bahrain. Bahrain has been under repression now for not a decade. I was first had stones thrown at my convoy in Bahrain in 1994. This is a country that's, it's only kept in power by the boots of the Saudi National Guard. Oman, another country, has some oil, but not very much. It has a population that's too large, and it doesn't have the magic of Sultan Qaboos anymore. I would be looking at little places like that and see if a year from now, once COVID is, I wouldn't say gone away, but under control, how do those places manage? Algeria doesn't quite fit, but in some ways it is the first canary. As Shadi rightly said, they had the first Arab Spring back in the 1990s, and now they're having another Algerian Spring, but which COVID has pushed to the side. The last thing I would say, Natan, I'm sure this is impossible to do, but I'd love to find a way to do it. There were several times in this conference, and I'll mention one in particular, when I really wanted to be able to have like a small chat room where our guests didn't hear what you said. You said, in essence, what he or she is really saying is this, but they're kind of hiding it under that. And I'll give you an example.
You are correct. We will not be able to do that.
Ambassador Kumar, very impressive, articulate, a class act. When I asked her about Yemen, she went on and on about the UN Security Council resolution. Well, the UN Security Council resolution is a disaster. It's one of the biggest reasons we don't have peace in Yemen. And of course, she's the author of this UN Security Council resolution, but she didn't want to say that. She implicitly hinted at it at one point when she said Jordan was president of the Security Council when it was passed. Yes, Madam Ambassador, and you were the permanent rep of Jordan who was pushing it forward. Despite the fact that many people in the UK and in the US mission knew this was a bad, bad mistake. Basically, the Jordanians pimped for the Saudis, what they were told. Yes, I know I can't think of a way to do it. I'm struggling with thinking of a way to do it. Maybe there could be a secret chat room down on the bottom somewhere. But it would be fun, that's for sure. Of course, we wouldn't get very many repeat guests.
No, we wouldn't. Shibli, I thank you for overcoming technical troubles in this Zoom era we're in. So we can hear you, I think. And our final question for you is, oh, and we can see you too.
Yeah, now I figured out using another camera. I'm sorry about the technology.
No
My laptop completely crashed, so I'm using a backup.
The good news about this this year is that we all understand. Our final question is if you think there is something that is not just on the conference agenda, but on the Biden administration's agenda at the moment, that is not on their agenda at the moment, and likely will be, or perhaps will be in a year or two, that is worth spotlighting at the moment.
Well, I think just let me take this question a little bit differently, because I heard what Bruce said about sort of this administration not being ambitious, not ambitious enough about the agenda in the Middle East, and I, at some level, of course, I agree with it 100%, especially given what we've heard, the limits of what was put on the table. But on the other hand, realistically, I'm not sure how much energy this administration is likely to spend on issues to get them done in the Middle East. I am reminded about the role, during the Obama administration when they made the Arab-Israeli issue a seemingly a priority issue, though not in practice. I think at least rhetorically, and setting the mood for pursuing that piece from day one of the Obama administration. How even with that, they didn't put enough into it to make it happen. And now, obviously, we're in a far worse shape than we were during the Obama administration on this, with far more urgent priorities. I'm not sure what could be done in this particular case. But I do think that the broader question about advocacy of human rights in the Middle East, which is something that obviously this administration is doing rhetorically, in the end, what will that mean? For now, it's a rhetorical conversation that they're having with leaders in the region. And they are, to their credit, doing it and doing it publicly in some cases. But then if you're not going to tie any action related to it, how meaningful is that? How is this going to impact not only how the region looks at us, but how credible this is going to be? I think that, there are urgent priorities pertaining to humanitarian aid that we're going to face immediately in a way that I'm not sure that Congress is going to be open to it, given all of the domestic priorities, including aid that is going to be necessary for Yemen, for Libya, for Iraq, for the Syrian refugees. I also don't think we're taking the refugee issue as a top priority. We have seen. We talk about it obviously as a humanitarian issue, but it's also a political issue. We've got millions of refugees that were created by the Iraq War and then the civil war, particularly in Syria, and certainly in addition to the Palestinian refugees, that are not just humanitarian issues. They're really political issues as well that are going to need more urgent attention. I don't see that stated in the priorities of the administration.
Thank you so much, everyone. And in the interest of time, I'm going to wrap. So I'm just going to say a few more words, which is that our whole agenda, of course, can be found at the Brookings website, brookings.edu. And very soon we'll have videos for all our different sessions available there. So you'll be able to visit and revisit them and critique everything that we said. I want to also just turn by thanking first everyone here on this panel, my colleagues here, Shadi Hamid and Bruce Rydell and Tamara Wittes and Shibli Tilhami, but also all our colleagues at the Center for Middle East Policy and in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings, headed by Suzanne Maloney, and Brookings in general, headed by John Allen. In particular, this whole week, of course, cannot be possible without enormous work by people behind the scenes. And so I'd like to name a few who did an enormous amount of work for this, and my deep gratitude is owed to them: Rachel Slattery and Ted Reinert, and Anna Newby, who heads the communications team in foreign policy, and Ed Berkey, who heads all our AV team and keeps us running, which is really not a simple thing to do in this day and age. And Adriana Pita and Andrea Risotto, who heads the communications team at Brookings writ large, and Kevin Huggard, who works very closely with many of us, and Nikki Sullivan, who keeps us running. And the people who are literally, at the moment, keeping us up. And those are Suzanne Schaefer and Harold Dalling and Trevor Bryan. And I'd like to ask the last, but certainly not the least, to join us for a moment on the screen. And that's really been my partner in organizing, not just in keeping us running here, but in organizing. It's a platitude to say that, but Isra Saber will be able to attest that I consulted her on absolutely every single item of this agenda, putting together the agenda, thinking of how to do it, confronting a million different problems with the cleverness and the ability and the skill. And we're just extremely fortunate to have you, Isra. Thank you for keeping us running. I'm envious of the law school that will steal you from us. Isra, thank you very much.
It's an absolute pleasure, Natan. Working with such incredible people makes it much easier.
Thank you, Isra, and thank you all very much for an interesting week. Please tune in for our future programming and especially our research at brookings.edu. Have a wonderful weekend. Thank you all in the region and the United States and everywhere else for joining us. Thanks and goodbye.